Have you ever given everything for your family, your trust, your money, your loyalty, only to realize you were nothing more than their walking ATM? That's exactly what happened to me. My parents called me in tears. Your sister's wedding is falling apart. She's desperate. Without you, there will be no wedding. I caved. I wired them $35,000, the kind of money that took me years of work and sacrifice to save. I told myself, finally they'll see me. Finally, I'll matter. But when I asked about the date of the wedding I had paid for, they looked me in the eye and said coldly, "She got married last week. It was only for family." Only for family. Words that shattered me and woke me up. Because to them, I was never family. I was their bank account. A month later, they had the audacity to come crawling back. "The mortgage is due. You'll cover it, right?" That's when I gave them their own words back. Only for family, remember, and not long after. The house they loved so much, the house that always excluded me, was gone. But that was just the beginning. If you think that's the revenge, wait until you see what came next. Because they didn't just lose the house, they lost everything. And I want to take you through every step of how I turned from their shadow into their nightmare. My name is Laura Mitchell. I'm 36 years old, a senior manager at an investment firm in Manhattan, making a solid $120,000 a year. I live in a luxury apartment with a sweeping view of the Hudson River. I drive a Tesla. I attend charity galas. To anyone watching from the outside, I am the picture of success. But the truth is very different. Behind the glass walls of my apartment, my life is quiet, lonely, and filled with scars that never healed. Scars not from the harshness of the world, but from the very place where I should have been loved the most, my family. Every Friday night when the office finally goes silent and Wall Street's noise fades into the evening, I come home, pour myself a glass of red wine, and sit by the wide window. The lights of the city glitter across the river, but my eyes always drift to a worn photo album I keep tucked beneath my coffee table. I've carried it with me since childhood, through every move and every chapter of my life. It doesn't comfort me. It reminds me. It shows me exactly when I became a shadow. In every photo, there she is. Emily. My sister, 4 years older, always front and center, smiling as though the world belonged to her. And there I am too, somewhere on the edge, blurred, holding a paper plate or smiling faintly, as if I wasn't sure I belonged in the picture at all. Even as a child, I could feel the imbalance. The spotlight was always on her. My family didn't abuse me in ways you could see. There were no bruises, no screaming matches that neighbors would overhear. Instead, it was quieter, sharper in its own way. It was favoritism, steady, relentless favoritism. Emily's birthdays came with expensive cakes, balloons relatives brought from far away. Mine were small, sometimes forgotten until late at night when my mother would remember and pull a cupcake from the fridge. Emily's stick figure drawings were praised as proof of natural talent, taped proudly to the fridge. My straight-A report cards, my academic certificates, were brushed aside with a quick, "That's expected from you." One memory has never left me. I was 12, fresh off winning first place in a statewide academic competition. I came home clutching the blue ribbon with my name embossed on it, my heart swelling with pride. I set it beside my plate at dinner, waiting for my parents to notice. But they never did. The whole evening was consumed with talk about Emily's audition for the school play. She hadn't even gotten the part, but her attempt filled the air with laughter, sympathy, and encouragement. My ribbon sat untouched, and my voice never found its way into the conversation. I went to bed that night realizing that if I wanted to celebrate, I'd have to do it alone. That became the rhythm of my life. When Emily stumbled, the family gathered to lift her back up to reassure her of how special she was. When I excelled, my success was treated as the bare minimum. No applause, no recognition, just silence. By the time I was grown, I had learned to play my role dependable, quiet, invisible. I built my own path, earned everything I have today, but I could never quite outrun the shadow Emily cast. Now as I sit here in my apartment, glass of wine in hand, the river gleaming beneath the city lights, I think of that shadow often. It has shaped me, defined me, but it has never destroyed me. I had grown used to being unseen, to swallowing the ache of being overlooked, but soon my parents and my sister would cross a line so deep, so final, that the quiet girl they ignored would vanish forever. And in her place, they would find someone they could never dismiss again. I had mastered being invisible, until they crossed the one line I couldn't ignore. From the time I was old enough to understand the weight of words, I realized that my parents spoke two very different languages, one for Emily and one for me. Emily's world was painted in gold. Every tiny accomplishment, no matter how trivial, was met with applause. When she brought home a crooked stick figure drawing my mother would beam as though it belonged in a museum. My father would place it on the fridge with pride, his voice warm with admiration, as he called her our little artist. They treated each scribble as if it were proof of her destiny, evidence that Emily was meant to shine. My world, however, was measured in silence. I could come home with a scholarship letter, a perfect test score, or a medal from school competitions, and the response was a quiet shrug. "That's expected from you," my father would say, already moving on to discuss Emily's latest idea or complaint. My mother often didn't even look up from whatever she was doing. Their indifference cut deeper than outright criticism ever could. I tried to bridge the gap to create connections where none existed. For Emily's birthdays, I would spend hours hunched over my desk writing her letters by hand. I didn't have much money, so gifts were often out of reach, but my words came from a place of sincerity. I would remind her of small memories, times when she laughed with me, or when we played together before she grew too old to care. I wrote about how much I admired her confidence, how I wished I could be more like her. Each year I hoped those words would touch her, would make her see me as more than the quiet shadow our parents had cast me into. But the letters never seemed to matter. Once I walked into her room and saw one of my letters sticking out of a paperback she had borrowed from a friend, used as nothing more than a bookmark. I later overheard her telling her friends with a smirk, "My weird sister writes me these little notes. I keep them so I don't hurt her feelings." They laughed and I smiled faintly, as if I hadn't heard, but inside I felt something wither. The impact of those moments was not immediate, but it was profound. Over time, I built a shell around myself. I became hyper-independent, determined to never need anyone because needing meant disappointment. I excelled at school not just because I was smart, but because books and numbers never dismissed me. Grades rewarded effort fairly. Equations never turned their backs. I poured myself into achievements that no one at home acknowledged, because at least in those quiet victories I could prove to myself that I was worthy. Yet even as I built this armor, there were cracks that no amount of effort could seal. Family dinners were the worst. I would sit at the long wooden table, the same one where every conversation seemed to orbit around Emily. My mother would ask her about her friends, her teachers, her dreams. My father would encourage her to talk more, to tell the stories she exaggerated so well. Sometimes they would look at me almost as an afterthought and say, "And how's school?" before quickly returning their attention to Emily's chatter. I would smile, answer briefly, and retreat back into myself. Later, when I was alone in my room, the weight of their neglect would settle over me. I cried quietly into my pillow more times than I can count, careful to keep the sound muffled so no one would hear. I didn't want their pity. I wanted their recognition. As the years went by, that recognition never came. Instead, the pattern repeated itself like a song stuck on loop. Emily was dazzling in their eyes, no matter what she did, while I remained the steady, dependable one whose worth was measured not in love, but in silence. That silence carved me into who I became. It made me strong, yes, but it also filled me with a growing storm I didn't yet know how to unleash. That silence only fed the growing injustice inside me. That silence I carried through my youth didn't end when I left home or built a life of my own. It followed me into adulthood, shaping how I let my family treat me even after I had the means to say no. I thought independence would free me, that once I lived in Manhattan with a career of my own, I would no longer be defined by their neglect. But instead, the silence simply evolved. It transformed into another form of exploitation, one that came through phone calls, messages, and carefully crafted pleas. By the time I was in my 30s, I had achieved what most people would call success. My career as a senior manager at an investment firm gave me security, and the apartment overlooking the Hudson was proof that I had built something entirely on my own. My colleagues respected me, and my friends admired me for my independence. But with my family, none of that mattered. When the phone rang and I saw my parents' number, I already knew the script. They weren't calling to ask about my day or to hear about the deals I had closed. They were calling because they needed something, and more often than not, that something was money. It always came disguised as an emergency. My mother's voice would tremble on the line as she said Emily's car had broken down, and the mechanic wanted $3,000 immediately. Or my father would clear his throat heavily and mutter about a sudden medical bill that had to be paid by the end of the week, $5,000 this time. The sense of urgency was always there, pressing down on me, designed to make me feel that if I didn't act right away, something catastrophic would happen. At first, I believed them. I sent the money quickly, telling myself I was doing what any daughter would do. But as the years passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The calls came every month like clockwork, sometimes twice a month. The emergencies never seemed to end, and curiously, they never seemed to be solved. Emily's car was always breaking down, even though it had supposedly been repaired several times. My father's medical needs never lessened, despite the fact that I covered bills consistently. There was always a new crisis, always a reason they needed me to step in. It was as if I had become the family's safety net, the invisible cushion that allowed them to stumble without consequence. I would hang up the phone after these calls with a knot in my stomach. There was no thank you, no acknowledgement of the strain it put on me. The expectation was clear: I had money, therefore I should share it. What else was family for? And though a part of me resented it, another part clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the way I could finally matter to them. If I kept giving, they would see my worth. They would realize that I wasn't invisible, that I was indispensable. That justification became my mantra. Family helps family. I told myself late at night, staring at the numbers in my bank account. I repeated it every time I wired money for another so-called emergency, every time I handed over my credit card information, every time I transferred savings I had worked years to build. I convinced myself it was love, it was duty, it was what good daughters did. But deep down, the cracks in that logic were spreading. The stress took its toll. I started waking up at 3 a.m, my heart racing, my mind spinning through numbers. How much had I given this year? How long would it take me to rebuild my emergency fund? Could I keep doing this forever? Sleep slipped away from me, replaced by long nights staring at the ceiling, my thoughts pounding like a drum. My success felt fragile, like it could collapse at any moment under the weight of their demands. And yet I couldn't stop. Each time the phone rang, I still answered. Each time the tears came through the receiver, I still reached for my wallet. I told myself that maybe this time would be the last. Maybe this time it really was an emergency. Maybe this time they would finally be grateful. But gratitude never came. All I ever heard was the next crisis waiting around the corner. Looking back now, I can see the truth clearly. I wasn't a daughter in their eyes. I wasn't a person to celebrate or even acknowledge. I was a resource. I was the account they could draw from whenever their own lives spun out of control. And with every transfer, every sleepless night, every whispered justification, I let them solidify that role for me. I had become their personal bank account with legs. The phone calls and constant emergencies had already worn me down, but the worst moments weren't always private. Sometimes they came in public when there was an audience, when my family made it clear that no matter what I gave, no matter how much I provided, I would never truly belong. That truth became undeniable the day of my grandmother's 80th birthday party. It was a big celebration, the kind of gathering my family always enjoyed. They rented a catering tent, set out rows of tables in the backyard of my parents' suburban New Jersey home, and invited more than 30 relatives. It should have been a warm event, one where generations came together to honor the woman who had held our family steady for so long. Instead, it became a spotlight for Emily and a painful reminder of my role as the shadow. From the moment I arrived, I could feel it. Emily was surrounded, her laughter ringing out as aunts and cousins asked her about her job, her new clothes, her life. Every story she told was received like a triumph. My uncle clapped her on the back and called her the family's pride. My mother beamed when someone asked about Emily's career in marketing, embellishing details to make it sound more glamorous than it really was. No one noticed that I had been promoted that year, that I managed teams and signed off on million-dollar deals. My work, my achievements, my sacrifices, they weren't part of the narrative. I took a seat at one of the long tables and listened. The conversations flowed around me, never toward me. When I tried to add a comment or share a small update from my own life, the words slipped into silence, drowned out by the next question about Emily's plans or her supposed accomplishments. I felt myself shrinking into the chair, smiling politely, while inside I was reminded again and again of my invisibility. Then came the moment that cut deepest. My mother, glass of wine in hand, raised her voice just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. She gestured toward me with a little laugh. "Laura's always so busy with her selfish career in the city," she said. "That's why she never has time for family. Some people just don't know how to slow down and enjoy what matters." The words hung in the air, sharper than any direct insult. Relatives glanced at me, some awkward, some amused, before turning back to Emily's stories. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that the so-called selfish career had been the very thing keeping the family afloat all these years, that without me many of these gatherings might not even have been possible. But I stayed silent. What would have been the point? They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for another reason to cast me as the outsider. The bitterness twisted deeper when I looked around the house where the party was being held. Just a year earlier, the roof had been leaking badly, threatening to collapse under heavy rains. My parents had called me in desperation, claiming they didn't have the funds for repairs, and I had quietly written a check for $10,000 to cover the cost. I hadn't asked for recognition. I thought maybe they would be grateful, maybe they would see me differently. But that night under that very roof, all I heard was laughter and praise for Emily, while I was made to feel like an intruder at my own family's table. The sting of that hypocrisy was unbearable. They celebrated beneath the safety of the roof I had paid for, mocking the career that had made it possible. I kept my face calm, my smile polite. But inside I felt something breaking, something shifting. It was a turning point, though I didn't yet know it. As the party continued, I sat quietly, my eyes drifting from Emily's radiant figure to the walls of the house I had helped preserve. My heart pounded with the weight of anger and betrayal, and the glass of water in my hand trembled slightly as I tried to hold steady. In that moment, I felt the full force of my invisibility. And yet I stayed seated, rooted to the spot, because I sensed something was coming. I wanted to leave, but I was waiting for something. After that birthday party, when I had sat in silence while my mother mocked my selfish career in front of everyone, I went back to my apartment with a hollowness I couldn't quite shake. I told myself I was done waiting for them to notice me, done, hoping they would finally see me as part of the family. Yet life has a cruel way of presenting the same test again, dressed in new clothing. Only a few weeks later, the phone rang. It was my mother, her voice thick with panic and tears. She told me Emily's engagement was in jeopardy, that her fiancé was threatening to call everything off because the wedding costs had ballooned to nearly $50,000. Apparently, Emily had champagne dreams on a beer budget, and David, her fiancé, was losing patience. Their fights had grown so loud that neighbors had overheard. My mother described it as a family crisis, a disaster that would bring shame upon all of them. As she spoke, I could hear the desperation behind her sobs, the practiced way she emphasized disgrace, honor, and reputation. She wasn't just painting a picture of Emily's heartbreak. She was laying out a trap, one tailored to my oldest wound, the yearning to belong. She said if Emily's wedding fell apart, the whole family would be humiliated. She repeated just this once, honey, for Emily's future, as if those words could make her plea sound temporary and noble. Then my father's voice came onto the line, trembling, telling me how proud they were of both their daughters, but that Emily needed this chance. They promised it would be the last time, swore they would never forget my generosity. My heart pounded as I listened. A part of me wanted to hang up to laugh at their theatrics. But another part, the little girl who had once written birthday letters, hoping for a smile, the teenager who had waited at the dinner table for someone to notice her achievements, leaned into their words like they were oxygen. What if this was the moment? What if helping them now would finally earn me a seat at the table, not in the corner as a forgotten guest? I imagined the wedding scene as they described it. Emily, radiant in a white dress, turning to me with tears in her eyes, finally acknowledging what I had done for her. I pictured her embracing me in front of everyone, whispering, "I couldn't have done this without you." I imagined my parents standing beside me, proudly introducing me as the daughter who had saved the day, the one they were grateful for. The fantasy was intoxicating, and I let it wash over me, even as a voice deep inside whispered that it was foolish. But my parents were relentless. They alternated between pleading and guilt. My mother's sobs grew more dramatic, and my father even quoted scripture about family being each other's keepers. They insisted this was about honor, about saving Emily's future, about avoiding scandal. They dangled those words like keys to a door I had never been allowed to walk through, the door to belonging, to recognition, to finally being wanted. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling while the city lights flickered outside. I thought about how many times I had given in before, how many checks had disappeared without a thank you, how many sacrifices had been brushed aside. And yet, despite knowing all of that, I felt the old hunger gnawing at me. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I rose from bed and sat by the window with a glass of water, watching the Hudson shimmer in the moonlight. My reflection in the glass looked tired, worn down by years of being overlooked. But I also saw a flicker of something else, hope, fragile and foolish, but hope nonetheless. I told myself this wasn't just about money, it was about proving to them once and for all that I mattered. By morning, the decision was made. I called my bank and arranged the transfer, $35,000. 4 months of my salary after taxes, 60% of my emergency savings gone in an instant. As I hung up, my hands trembled. The rational part of me screamed that I had just made a terrible mistake, but the little girl inside clung to the picture I had painted in my mind, the grateful smiles, the warm embraces, the long-awaited acknowledgement. I told myself I was investing in family, investing in love. I whispered that this would finally be the moment they saw me not as a wallet, but as a daughter, as a sister. My chest ached with both fear and longing. I knew the risk, but I pushed it aside, clutching the dream I had carried since childhood. I believed them. One last time. The morning after I finally caved to their pleas, I sat at my dining table with my laptop open and the bank's transfer screen staring back at me. My finger hovered over the confirm button longer than it should have, but the voices of my parents from the night before still echoed in my head. My mother's sobs, my father's trembling insistence that this was about family honor. I typed the number 35,000. Seeing it on the screen made my breath catch. It was more money than I had ever sent anyone in my life, more than I had ever dared to spend on myself in one go. It represented 4 months of my hard work, 60% of the savings I had guarded for years against emergencies. I hesitated, thinking of all the things that money could do for me: security, freedom, maybe even a home of my own someday. Then, with one final exhale, I clicked confirm. The confirmation screen flashed, and the money was gone. Just like that. My account balance shrank dramatically, a visible hole carved out of the safety net I had spent so long weaving. My chest tightened with panic, but before it could fully settle in, I forced myself to spin the story differently. This wasn't a loss, I told myself. This was an investment not in stocks or bonds, but in family, in love, in belonging. I whispered in my mind that this was the price of finally buying my seat at the table, of finally being part of the story, rather than the forgotten shadow on the side. I sat back in my chair, staring out the window at the city skyline. The Hudson glittered in the morning light, almost mocking me with its calm surface while my insides roiled. I clutched my coffee mug as if it could ground me, and in that quiet moment, I allowed myself to dream. I pictured Emily's wedding day, the music swelling, the guests rising as she walked down the aisle. And then I imagined a moment just before the toasts where she would take the microphone and say, "This day would not have been possible without my sister." I saw her turning to me, tears in her eyes, calling me forward in front of everyone, hugging me with real gratitude for the first time in our lives. In that fantasy, my parents stood beside us, beaming, finally proud, finally acknowledging me not just as the one who kept them afloat, but as their daughter equal to Emily. It was foolish, maybe, but the picture was vivid enough that I could almost feel it. I saw myself sitting at the head table next to Emily and David, my name mentioned in the thank you speeches, my presence cherished instead of dismissed. I imagined relatives walking up to me with warm handshakes, telling me how generous I was, how proud they were to call me family. I even let myself believe for a moment that Emily and I might become close again, that this would bridge the chasm that had always divided us. Of course, the other voice was there too, the skeptical, cold voice that had kept me alive through years of neglect. It whispered that I had just made the same mistake again, only bigger. It asked me why I thought this time would be any different, why I believed people who had only ever taken from me without gratitude. I tried to push that voice aside, tried to bury it beneath the hopeful image of belonging, but it lingered like smoke in the back of my mind. The rest of that day I walked around my apartment in a daze. The space that usually felt safe and comfortable seemed suddenly fragile, as though it might collapse with the weight of what I had done. I tidied shelves, folded laundry, cooked dinner, all while replaying the transfer in my mind. Each time I told myself the same thing: this was my ticket in my proof of loyalty, the sacrifice that would finally be acknowledged. I rehearsed the moment I would hear my name spoken in gratitude, as if practicing for an award ceremony I'd never been invited to before. When night fell, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window again, the city lights twinkling across the water. I whispered aloud, "This will make them see me." The words sounded hollow in the empty room, but I clung to them anyway. I thought about how long I had lived on the margins of their affection, how I had been the dependable one, the quiet one, the one who never caused trouble but also never received applause. I told myself this was the moment that narrative would change. I went to bed with a strange mix of fear and anticipation. I felt the loss in my bank account, yes, but I convinced myself it was worth it. That in just a few weeks at that wedding, all the wounds of the past would be stitched together by one public act of recognition. I closed my eyes with the fragile hope that I had finally bought my way into the story of my family, no longer the forgotten shadow. But deep down in the quiet place, I didn't want to acknowledge something felt off. I didn't know exactly what, but there was a hollowness in their pleas, a sharpness in Emily's silence, a crack in the fantasy I was trying to build. Still, I buried that doubt beneath the weight of $35,000 already gone, convincing myself I had no choice but to believe this would work. I didn't know I had just bought a one-way ticket to hell. The weeks that followed the transfer felt like a strange blend of relief and anticipation. I had drained more money from my savings than I thought I ever would, but I kept telling myself it would all be worth it once the wedding came. I waited for the invitation to arrive, checking my mailbox every evening after work, half expecting to see a thick envelope with gold lettering. Each day, when there was nothing but bills and advertisements, I reassured myself that maybe they were just running late with the printing, or maybe they planned something special, a personal delivery to make me feel included. I clung to every excuse I could invent, trying to silence the unease growing louder inside me. Finally, unable to take the suspense any longer, I called my mother. My voice shook as I asked, "When is the wedding? I need to make arrangements." There was a pause on the line too long to be innocent, and then she laughed lightly, saying, "Oh, it's just going to be a small family thing. Nothing fancy. Probably next weekend, but you know how things change." The words were evasive, slippery, like she was trying to brush me off without actually lying. I pressed again, asking for a date for a time for anything concrete. Her tone hardened just slightly. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. Just let us handle it. It's family." Then she hung up before I could ask again. The knot in my stomach tightened. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe they wanted to surprise me. Maybe Emily was overwhelmed with planning. I fought against the suspicion clawing at me, refusing to believe that after I had given them so much they would exclude me. But the truth has a way of surfacing whether you want it or not. It came to me in the cruelest way possible. I was at work scrolling through my phone during lunch when I got a notification. A college friend had tagged me in photos. I clicked absent-mindedly, expecting maybe some old memory from years ago. Instead, the screen filled with images of a lavish wedding. White roses cascading over tall crystal vases, strings of lights glowing in the background, a banquet hall packed with more than 150 guests. And there in the center of it all was Emily. She wore a gown that could have been pulled from a magazine, delicate lace sleeves, a sweeping train, and a sparkle that screamed of its $8,000 price tag. I knew instantly it was the dress I had unknowingly paid for the centerpiece of the dream wedding I had funded. She looked radiant, smiling radiant enough that any outsider would assume she was a woman surrounded by love and support. But all I could feel was the hollow pit in my chest widening with every photo I swiped through. The captions were what broke me. Under one of the pictures of Emily raising her champagne glass, she had written, "Finally free of my sister's shadow, today is my day." The words hit me like a slap across the face. My sister, the one I had bled myself dry for, the one I thought I might finally connect with through this act of generosity, had declared to the world that my very existence was something to escape from. Friends and acquaintances commented their congratulations, adding notes like, "So happy you cut out toxic people and you deserve this happiness." They didn't know those toxic people were me. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from another friend. "Hey, I didn't see you at the wedding. Everything okay?" I stared at the screen, numb, trying to process how to respond. How could I explain that I hadn't been invited to the wedding I had paid for, that I had been erased from the very event that should have been my chance at recognition? My hands shook so violently, I had to set the phone down. That evening, still in shock, I tried calling my parents again. My father answered this time, his voice clipped, almost annoyed. When I asked directly why I hadn't been told the date, why I hadn't been invited, he simply said, "It was last week. Just close family. You shouldn't make this about you." Then he hung up before I could reply. Just close family. The same words they had used to dismiss me for years, now weaponized to justify my complete exclusion. I sank into my sofa, staring blankly at the walls of my apartment. Every detail of that wedding had been built on my sacrifice. The venue, the flowers, the gown, the food, my money had woven the fabric of that day. And yet, I hadn't even been deemed worthy of a seat at the table, not even worthy of a mention in a toast. I had been written out of the story altogether, my role reduced to an invisible benefactor, erased when the spotlight turned on. My mind kept circling back to Emily's caption, "Finally free of my sister's shadow." Was that really how she had seen me all these years? Not as a younger sister trying to belong, but as some looming presence she needed to escape from. I thought about the little girl who had once written letters desperate for her approval. I thought about the woman who had drained her savings to give her this perfect day. All of it seemed laughable now, pathetic even. I had spent my life reaching out a hand, and she had used it only to step higher while pushing me further down. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, replaying the betrayal over and over until the tears finally stopped and something colder settled in their place. If I wasn't family in their eyes, if I wasn't even worth a chair at a table I had paid for, then what was I? If I wasn't family, what was I? The silence after my father's words echoed longer than the call itself. It was last week. Just close family. The phrase replayed in my mind like a cruel chorus, each repetition sharper than the last. I sat in my darkened apartment staring at nothing and felt the weight of my own foolishness pressing down on me. I had been erased from the very day I had sacrificed for. My money had bought the flowers, the food, the gown, the hall, and yet my existence had been treated as disposable. When the first sting of betrayal dulled, something else began to stir inside me, something heavier and darker. But before that transformation could fully form, I drifted into the well-worn grooves of memory, pulling out every old wound they had left behind. I remembered the birthdays most clearly. Each year, Emily's parties were productions worthy of envy, balloons filling the living room, expensive cakes with her name piped in, frosting presents stacked higher than the kitchen table. I would hover on the edges, pretending to help with decorations or snacks, waiting for my turn to be noticed. When my birthday came, the living room was quiet. Maybe a small cake, maybe not. Sometimes a card signed hurriedly, sometimes nothing at all. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, but each forgotten candle carved another hollow in my chest. Graduations were no different. I could still feel the heat of the sun on the back of my neck as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, the roar of applause for other students ringing in my ears. When I searched the crowd, my parents' seats were empty. They had gone to watch Emily at a community theater rehearsal instead. I told myself I didn't need their cheers, that my achievements were mine alone, but the silence that greeted me afterward was deafening. Even the small things added up: school awards, report cards with straight A's, scholarships, earned through sleepless nights. Each one was brushed aside with a perfunctory nod, while Emily's stick figure drawings were praised as masterpieces. I carried those slights like invisible scars, thinking they had numbed me by now. But after the wedding, I realized they had never faded at all. They had only been waiting for a moment like this to ignite into something fierce. In the days that followed, I found myself combing through old messages, trying to piece together where I had gone wrong, trying to understand why I had believed them again. That's when I stumbled upon a text from Emily sent years ago when she had asked for tuition money. "I hate asking you," it read. "I feel so pressured by Mom and Dad. I wouldn't if I had a choice." At the time, those words had softened me. I had imagined her trapped just like me, a victim of their manipulations. It was why I had sent the check without hesitation. Reading it now with the clarity that betrayal brings, I saw it for what it was: a script, a calculated move to tug at my empathy, to disguise greed as reluctance. How many times had she played me like that, crafting words to make me believe she was unwilling, when in truth she was orchestrating the whole performance? My stomach turned as I scrolled through more messages, each one a variation of the same theme. I had been blind willingly. Blind because the alternative was admitting the people I loved most had only ever seen me as a resource. The grief was suffocating at first. I spent nights curled on the couch, tears soaking into the pillow, mourning not just the wedding, but every memory that had been tainted by the realization that I was never loved the way I deserved. But grief is a strange thing. It morphs if you let it. Soon the sadness hardened into anger, a cold, burning fury that reached back through decades of neglect. I thought about every hour I had worked overtime to send them money, every vacation I had skipped to build my savings, every time I had silenced my own needs for theirs. And for what? To be excluded, to be mocked, to be erased. The anger didn't consume me all at once. It settled like a slow fire, deliberate and steady. With it came something sharper: resolve. I knew then that the days of waiting for their approval were over. I would never again beg for a place at their table. But still, in the quietest hours of the night, a small voice whispered doubts. What if I was wrong to cut them off? What if they really were desperate, really were victims of their own poor choices? I would lie awake wrestling with those questions, torn between the icy clarity of rage and the lingering ache of a daughter still craving love. That fragile thread of hope made me hesitate. Part of me still wanted to believe in redemption, in the possibility that one day Emily would turn to me and say she was sorry, that my parents would finally see the truth of what they had done. It was foolish, maybe, but it was human. I didn't want to admit that the people who were supposed to protect me had never intended to. That thread kept me from cutting the cord completely, even as I knew deep down it would strangle me if I let it. I stared at the ceiling one night, the city buzzing faintly outside, and I realized something had shifted permanently. I was no longer the invisible girl in the corner. I was no longer the obedient daughter with open hands and a soft heart. They had killed that version of me. In her place stood someone colder, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by finally fighting back. I had been forged in their neglect, and now I would turn that fire against them. They had created an enemy. But I still had one fragile thread of hope. A month had passed since I discovered the truth about the wedding, and though the wound was still raw, I had started to regain some sense of composure. I had buried myself in work, in late nights at the office and early mornings with coffee that never seemed strong enough, convincing myself that keeping busy would dull the ache. I told myself I was done letting them hurt me, done being the puppet on their strings. But as I would soon learn, they were not finished with me. It was a Saturday morning when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but the number flashing across the screen was familiar. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. My mother's voice came through, not with hesitation or remorse, but with the same entitled tone I knew too well. "Laura, have you sent the mortgage payment yet?" she asked, as if she were confirming the delivery of groceries. There was no preamble, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just expectation, as if my role in their lives had been officially codified, not daughter, not sister, but financier. I felt my stomach knot, but I stayed silent long enough for her to keep talking. "The bank is asking questions," she continued, "and you know how embarrassing it would be for us to be late again. We told the neighbors you handle these things for us now." Her words carried the weight of assumption, not request. They had told people I was their banker, their provider, their permanent safety net, as though I had signed a contract to shoulder their lives indefinitely. Before I could respond, another voice cut in, syrupy sweet and unmistakably false. "Hey, Laura, it's me," Emily said, her tone coated in an imitation of warmth I hadn't heard in years. "I just wanted to say thank you again for everything you did. The wedding was amazing. I know you must have felt left out, but it wasn't personal." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter, every muscle in my body taut. And then faintly, I heard it, the clinking of glasses, the distant thrum of music, and the unmistakable sound of waves. She wasn't calling from home. She was on a honeymoon paid for with my money, lounging in luxury while pretending contrition. Her performance was grotesque. She carried on saying, "David and I almost didn't make it without your help. You really saved us. I hope you can understand why things were so hectic." She paused, waiting for me to swallow her act to reassure her that I understood to accept the crumbs of her counterfeit apology. Something inside me shifted then. The grief that had weighed on me for weeks hardened into something crystalline and sharp. I could feel my pulse steady, my breathing slow, as if my body had finally accepted what my heart already knew: I was not family to them, not in the way that mattered. I was an open wallet with a pulse. I let a silence hang heavy, so heavy that I imagined Emily growing uncomfortable on the other end. Then, with a calmness that surprised even me, I said, "Only for family, remember." The words cut clean, deliberate, a mirror of the weapon they had used to exclude me. Before either of them could respond, I ended the call. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the blank screen of my phone, listening to the quiet hum of my apartment. My hands were steady now. My chest no longer ached with longing. Instead, I felt something close to relief. I had given them my answer not with a scream or a breakdown, but with the same coldness they had shown me. For once, I had matched their cruelty and ended it on my own terms. But even as I sat in that silence, a new realization began to bloom. They believed I was still their resource, still their solution, still the daughter too weak to walk away. That belief, that false hope, was their Achilles' heel. They would keep coming back, certain I would cave, certain I would return to the role they had carved for me. And in that certainty, they had handed me the very weapon I needed. That was the moment I began planning, and their false hope would be my weapon. When I hung up the phone after telling them, "Only for family," remember, something inside me settled. For years, I had been the one who scrambled, who emptied her account, who sacrificed without question. In that single sentence, I had finally mirrored their own cruelty back to them. But I knew it wasn't enough to speak words into the air. I had to act. They still believed I would come back, that I was too soft, too loyal, too broken to sever the ties that kept them afloat. If I wanted to end this cycle, I had to cut them off completely. The next morning, I sat down at my computer and pulled up every account I had linked to them. There were more than I realized, automatic transfers I had set up years ago when Dad said he needed just a little help with bills, credit cards I had added them to, as authorized users when Mom claimed her car broke down, small safety nets that had slowly multiplied until they were nooses tightening around my own life. One by one, I canceled them. I deleted the recurring transfers, removed their names from my cards, changed passwords on my accounts, even called the bank to make sure no more charges could slip through under their names. With each cancellation, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. By the end of the morning, they had no access left. At first, the silence was startling. For a few hours, no calls came. I almost believed they hadn't noticed yet. But then, like clockwork, my phone lit up. The first message was pleading, "Laura, sweetheart, we need the mortgage. Please, you know how much this means to us." I ignored it. Another came a few minutes later. "We'll lose everything if you don't help. Don't do this to your family." I muted my notifications and went about my day, refusing to cave. But they didn't stop. That night alone, I counted 37 missed calls. The voicemails piled up, each one more desperate than the last. My mother's voice cracked with sobs, begging me not to abandon them. My father's tone grew harsher, accusing me of being ungrateful, selfish, cold. Emily even chimed in, her voice sugar-coated but dripping with disdain. "I don't know why you're making this about you, Laura. You always have to ruin things. Just help us like you always do." It was astonishing how quickly the begging shifted to blame, as though my refusal to be their safety net was the true betrayal, not the years of using me like an endless resource. By the second day, the messages turned darker. "If you keep this up, you'll regret it." My father's voice growled in one recording. "Family doesn't turn its back. People will know what kind of daughter you are." Another voicemail followed with my mother's whisper, almost venomous despite the feigned softness. "We gave you life, and this is how you repay us. You'll never find peace if you abandon us." Their words should have stung, but they didn't. Instead, they revealed the truth I had been blind to for too long. Love to them was nothing more than leverage. That evening, as I sat on my couch with the phone buzzing endlessly on the coffee table, I picked it up, scrolled through the incoming calls, and pressed block. One number, then another, then another. I blocked them all, my parents, Emily, even the landline at their house. For the first time in years, my phone went silent. The quiet was strange at first, almost unsettling. But as the hours passed, it became a balm. For the first night I could remember, I lay in bed without fear of being jolted awake by a crisis that was never mine to fix. I slept deeply, dreamlessly, wrapped in a stillness that felt almost sacred. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streaming across my room, I realized just how much space their chaos had occupied in my life. Without it, I felt lighter, sharper, clearer. I no longer carried the constant weight of dread, the endless calculation of how much I could give before breaking. I had taken back something they had stolen from me long ago, control. But as liberating as it was, I knew this was only the first step. Cutting the lifeline didn't erase the years of debt, financial and emotional, they owed me. It didn't make up for the stolen opportunities, the sleepless nights, the humiliations endured in silence. No, I wasn't finished. Blocking their calls was only the beginning. They had taken from me without remorse, and now it was time they learned what it felt like to pay. I would make them pay back. Every single dollar. When I finally cut the financial lifeline, there was a moment of quiet I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since I could remember, I wasn't waiting for my phone to ring with another demand disguised as an emergency. But that quiet was deceptive. Deep down, I knew it was only the calm before the next storm. My parents and Emily had drained me for so long that I couldn't shake the suspicion that the money trail ran deeper than I had ever realized. That was when I made the decision to put everything in the hands of a professional. If there were skeletons hiding in the closets of my financial history, I wanted them dragged out into the daylight. I scheduled an appointment with a family finance attorney. Walking into that polished Manhattan office with folders of bank statements, tax returns, and half-forgotten bills stuffed into a leather satchel, I felt both nervous and determined. For years I had told myself I was overreacting, that maybe I was too harsh in judging my family. But now, staring across the polished mahogany desk at a man who had spent decades unraveling cases of financial abuse, I felt something else: validation. He didn't look at me like I was crazy. He looked at me like he had seen this exact story play out dozens of times before. We spent hours combing through my records. I handed him copies of transfers I had made for car repairs, medical bills, and school fees, the same stories I had swallowed over and over again. He tapped at a calculator, occasionally raising his eyebrows, occasionally letting out a low whistle. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and gave me a number that made my blood run cold: $127,000. That was the total amount I had given my parents and Emily over the past 10 years. $127,000. More than the down payment on a home, more than enough to fund a child's college education, more than enough to secure my own future. Instead, it had gone into the black hole of their endless emergencies. I sat there staring at the figure scribbled on his legal pad, and I wanted to be sick. That wasn't generosity anymore. That was theft by manipulation. But that wasn't even the worst of it. When he ran a credit report under my name, he found something I hadn't expected. There, clear as day, were accounts I had never opened, balances I had never touched. At 18 years old, barely an adult, barely beginning my own life, my parents had used my Social Security number to open credit lines in my name. They had carried those debts for years, letting interest pile up quietly, damaging my credit, while I worked myself half to death, believing I was being responsible. $23,000. That was the total, sitting there in black and white, hanging over my head like a storm cloud I had never seen coming. $23,000 that I never borrowed, never spent, but was legally tied to my name. I thought back to the years of side jobs in college, the nights I spent agonizing over bills, wondering why it always felt like I was one step behind no matter how hard I worked. Now I had my answer. My family had set me up to fail before I even had the chance to stand on my own feet. The attorney's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "This is fraud," he said. "It's not a gray area. They stole your identity, and you have grounds not just for recovery, but for damages." Hearing those words was like being doused with ice water. For years I had allowed myself to believe I was complicit, that giving them money was my choice, that somehow it was on me to keep the family together. But this wasn't choice. This was criminal. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated, the part that turned my stomach more than anything else. Among the documents, there was a loan categorized as home improvement. It had Emily's name co-signed right next to mine. My pulse quickened as I tried to remember ever agreeing to such a thing. I hadn't. But the records were crystal clear. Emily had put her name down as guarantor, and the money from that loan, tens of thousands, had been traced not to contractors or supply stores, but to travel agencies and luxury resorts. My sister, the one whose wedding I had funded, had literally signed on to a loan in both our names so she could have her perfect honeymoon. She had sold the lie of improving our family home while jetting off to paradise with her new husband, all while leaving me to shoulder the legal responsibility. I sat in that office, gripping the arms of the chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rage I felt was almost unbearable. It wasn't just that they had lied to me. It was that they had built an entire empire of deceit on my back. My parents had stolen my identity before I was even grown, and Emily had joined them, willingly co-signing lies to finance her own luxury. My whole life I had been told I was selfish, too focused on myself, too cold compared to Emily's warmth. But looking at those documents, I realized who the selfish ones really were. They hadn't just used me. They had carved up my future like vultures picking at a carcass. The attorney slid the papers back across the desk to me. "We can take action," he said simply. "We have the evidence. They can't wriggle out of this." His confidence steadied me, gave me a clarity I hadn't had in years. For so long, I had been afraid of being the bad guy, of being the daughter who turned her back on family. But now, I saw it clearly. They had turned their backs on me decades ago. All I was doing was reclaiming what was mine. I left his office that day with a folder full of evidence and a new fire in my chest. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about justice. It was about finally standing up after a lifetime of being told to sit quietly in the shadows. And it was about Emily, my sister, who had once been my idol, now revealed as just another thief wearing a crown she didn't deserve. The law would be my first strike, and Emily had signed her own doom. When my lawyer laid out the evidence of years of financial abuse, I felt both fury and a strange sense of vindication. Yet I knew those numbers on paper, the loans, the credit fraud, even Emily's forged signature, were just the surface of something larger. The law was powerful, but what I needed next was proof that cut to the bone something they couldn't spin into another sob story or beg their way out of. That's when my lawyer suggested I hire a private investigator, someone who could dig into property records and confirm what I had long suspected, that the very house my parents flaunted as their proudest possession might not even be entirely theirs. I agreed without hesitation. The investigator was a quiet man with sharp eyes, the kind who noticed details most of us would overlook. He met me in a coffee shop, laid out a folder with neatly tabbed documents, and slid them across the table. As I flipped through them, I felt my chest tighten. He had traced 8 years of my contributions, every check, every loan, every quiet payment I made for repairs, renovations, and upgrades. The total came to $45,000. He looked me square in the eye and said, "Legally speaking, you're not just a daughter who helped out. You're a creditor. You have claim." The words hit me like a hammer. For years I had believed I was only donating, tossing money into a pit of obligation. Now I realized those payments gave me leverage. Real leverage against the family who had treated me like nothing. What startled me most was how blatant the numbers looked on paper. I had paid for the new roof after a storm ripped shingles off. I had covered the contractor who remodeled the kitchen so Emily could host her birthday in style. I even paid the plumber who replaced their faulty pipes when the basement flooded. Each time I told myself it was my duty as the responsible daughter. Each time they had thanked me with words laced in guilt. "Emily needs the house to look good for her future." But now those receipts were transformed into ammunition proof that the house wasn't theirs alone. The investigator had gone further. He found the mortgage records revealing that my parents still owed $78,000 to the bank. He shook his head as he explained that without my monthly transfers, which had now stopped, they were already behind on payments. Default wasn't some distant possibility, it was looming. They had no savings, no stable income, and no way to catch up. Their sanctuary, the place where they had held court, as though they were kings and queens, was already hanging by a thread. I remember staring at those numbers, a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction rising in me. That house had been the stage for so much of my humiliation. I had been ignored in its dining room, belittled in its living room, dismissed in the kitchen where Emily always held the spotlight. I had walked through its halls like a ghost, giving everything and receiving nothing. And yet part of me still remembered decorating the Christmas tree there or laughing with my grandmother in the back garden. The house was tied to every wound I carried, but it was also tied to my childhood. The realization that I now held the power to take it away left me with an almost unbearable sense of gravity. My lawyer didn't hesitate. He explained that with the investigator's records we could file a creditor's claim against the property. In plain terms, it meant my parents would either have to pay me back or risk losing the house entirely. He laid out the forms with calm efficiency, pointing to each signature line as if he were guiding me through an ordinary contract. My hand trembled as I signed, not out of doubt, but out of the sheer weight of what I was doing. This wasn't another check written to bail them out. This was me finally drawing a line in stone. The next morning, the legal wheels began to turn. Notices were prepared, filings sent to the court. I imagined the look on my parents' faces when they opened the envelope expecting maybe a birthday card or a conciliatory gesture, and instead finding a legal document that stripped away their last illusion of control. For decades, they had told the world, "This is our home, our pride." But soon the truth would be undeniable. Their castle had been built partly on my back, and I had just set the timer on its collapse. I walked past the house that week, driving slowly through the old neighborhood. From the outside, it looked the same. The white shutters, the manicured lawn, the swing Emily used to sit on pretending she was a princess. But I saw it differently now. I didn't see a fortress anymore. I saw cracks in the walls, foundations sinking the weight of lies pressing down on every brick. They had thought that house was untouchable, the proof of their status. They had no idea it was already half mine. As I parked down the street, I remembered the night I had come over after work to fix a leaky faucet myself, because they claimed they couldn't afford a plumber. Emily had been sitting in the living room, painting her nails, complaining about how hard her life was. I had been on my knees with a wrench tightening the pipe while my parents offered her lemonade. That memory, paired with the documents in my bag, solidified my resolve. They had treated me like the help. Now they would learn what it meant when the help sent the bill. The legal process was slow, but each step gave me strength. I felt like I was reclaiming more than money, I was reclaiming my worth. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the forgotten daughter or the silent shadow. I was the one holding the pen, writing the terms, shaping the future. My parents had always believed they controlled the narrative that Emily's wedding, their house, their reputation would always be untouchable. They were wrong. When I returned to my apartment that night, I sat by the window overlooking the Hudson and whispered to myself, "It's finally my turn." The papers were filed, the claim was in motion, and there was no turning back. Every brick of that house carried my fingerprints, and soon the world would know it. The house they flaunted was already slipping away. When the legal claim against my parents' house was set in motion, I thought my fight was primarily with them. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the cracks would spread beyond their walls and into Emily's carefully constructed new life. The wedding she had paraded across social media, the marriage she flaunted as her crowning achievement, began to crumble almost immediately once the truth about the money surfaced. It started when David's parents went through routine financial discussions with him. They were the kind of people who balanced their checkbooks down to the penny, who reviewed every expense when tax season came around. In their review of the wedding costs, they noticed certain payments that didn't line up with what Emily had told them. Curious, they dug deeper. Bank records showed that large transfers had come from my account. It was clear I had paid for the majority of the wedding. The question that followed was one Emily had no good answer for. Why had she allowed me to cover the bills without so much as a word to her in-laws? I wasn't there to hear it, but word reached me quickly. David's parents confronted Emily directly, asking why her younger sister had been forced to fund what they thought was a proud family event. Emily, cornered, did what she always did best: she lied. She claimed I had insisted on paying, that I was manipulative, that I had used my financial stability to force my way into their celebration. She painted me as a controlling figure desperate for relevance. It was the same story she had spun for years, only now the audience was different. But lies have a way of fraying when examined closely. David, to his credit, was not as gullible as Emily expected. Late one night, while she was in the shower, he went through her financial documents, something he had avoided before out of trust. What he found shocked him. Among the records was a transfer of $5,000 from the wedding account into Emily's personal account, money she had siphoned away under the guise of miscellaneous costs. That money hadn't gone to flowers or catering. It had gone straight into Emily's pocket. The discovery shattered whatever illusions he had left. David confronted her, and from that moment their home was no longer peaceful. He accused her of exploiting me, of lying to him, of building their marriage on deceit. Emily, cornered again, lashed out. She doubled down on her lies, shouting that I had orchestrated everything, that I was jealous, that I wanted to ruin her marriage, just as I had always ruined her life. David didn't buy it. Each word she screamed only pushed him further away. The fights became a nightly ritual. Neighbors reported raised voices through the walls of their apartment. I heard from someone in their building that Emily's shrill defenses often ended in sobs, while David's voice grew quieter and colder each day. Their once picture-perfect life was unraveling in full view of anyone close enough to notice. It wasn't long before David began staying late at work, avoiding the apartment altogether. I didn't need to lift a finger. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to be the one cleaning up the mess. Emily's lies were doing all the work for me. Watching from a distance, I felt a mixture of grim satisfaction and profound clarity. The golden child, the one who had always been shielded, who had basked in praise while I was made invisible, was now caught in her own trap. Her new family was seeing her the way I had seen her all along, not as a victim, not as a star, but as a manipulator who couldn't stop herself from reaching for more, even when she already had everything she claimed to want. The fallout reached me indirectly. A cousin mentioned that David had called him for advice, asking how someone could discover that their spouse had lied about something so fundamental and still move forward. I knew then that whatever remained of Emily's fairy tale was hanging by a thread. I had imagined her marriage as untouchable as the fortress she would retreat to once her lies about me began to crumble. But even that fortress was already cracking from within. Every night they screamed at each other, another brick loosened. Every day David withdrew further, another wall fell. Emily had wanted the perfect marriage as proof of her superiority, the ultimate validation of all the favoritism she had been given. But what she ended up with was a husband who no longer trusted her in-laws, who no longer respected her, and a sister she had underestimated for far too long. Even her perfect marriage was splintering. The news of Emily's nightly fights with David reached me like the faint echo of a storm I had seen forming from miles away. I knew her lies had begun to corner her, but I also knew Emily had spent her whole life wriggling out of accountability. She had turned manipulation into an art form, and for years I had been her most loyal audience. This time I refused to let her spin another tale that painted her as the wounded heroine. If her marriage was beginning to fracture, I was going to make sure the cracks widened until the truth poured through for everyone to see. I started with what I had always saved in silence: the evidence. For years I had tucked away messages, voicemails, and emails that never sat right with me. Emily's texts where she admitted in her own words that she asked for money because Mom and Dad pressured me even when no such pressure existed. Voicemails where she mocked me to mutual friends, laughing about how easy it was to get me to send money because Laura thinks it'll finally make her part of the family. I had saved receipts from bank transfers labeled as urgent medical expenses that were withdrawn from ATMs in cities where Emily happened to be vacationing. For years, I collected them out of instinct, a quiet act of self-preservation, even as I told myself I was overreacting. Now those records became my arsenal. Late one night, I sat at my dining table with folders spread across the wood surface pages, marked and organized recordings queued on my laptop. I knew exactly who needed to see this: David's family, the people who already suspected that their son had been dragged into a web of lies, and Emily's colleagues, the people who still believed she was the polished, competent professional she pretended to be. Both groups needed the truth. So I prepared 2 identical packages neatly bound with no return address. Inside, I included copies of the texts where she bragged about manipulating me, the receipts showing withdrawals that contradicted her stories, and transcripts of her voice messages mocking my so-called gullibility. I didn't need to add commentary. Her words spoke louder than anything I could say. Dropping those envelopes into a public mailbox gave me a thrill unlike anything I had felt before. It wasn't joy exactly, and it wasn't relief. It was justice, the sense that the imbalance of decades was finally being corrected, that the pedestal Emily had stood on for so long was beginning to wobble under the weight of her own actions. I didn't need to shove her off. I only had to let her own words do the work. But I didn't stop there. I wanted something current, undeniable, and impossible to refute. So I set a trap. I created an anonymous email account and wrote Emily pretending to be a concerned friend who had overheard rumors about her marriage struggles. I mentioned David's parents growing suspicious, and I hinted that certain records had come to light. I carefully crafted the message to sound like someone sympathetic but nosy, the type of person who wanted the inside scoop. I knew Emily's ego wouldn't let her stay silent. She couldn't resist explaining herself, justifying spinning her version before anyone else could control the narrative. It didn't take long. Within hours, she replied, her words spilling out in frantic paragraphs. She wrote that yes, she had taken money from me, but it wasn't her fault. Our parents had always expected her to maintain appearances, and David's family didn't understand the pressure she was under. She admitted pocketing the $5,000, claiming she deserved compensation for the stress of planning the wedding. She even wrote that I had been easy to manipulate because she never learned how to say no, as if it were a weakness she was entitled to exploit. Every line was damning. Every justification confirmed the picture I was painting of her character. I saved that email, printed it, and added it to the growing pile of evidence. I didn't need to send it anywhere just yet. Timing mattered. Reputation didn't collapse. In an instant, it unraveled slowly, thread by thread, until the whole garment fell apart. For years, Emily had been wrapped in the fabric of favoritism and deception. I was pulling at the seams. Word trickled back to me within days of the packages arriving. David's mother called me, her voice a mixture of sympathy and outrage. She told me she had read every page, listened to every recording, and that she finally understood what I had endured. "We thought Emily was just spoiled," she admitted. "We didn't realize how cruel she had been to you. It was the closest thing to validation I had ever received from anyone tied to my family." And it wasn't just them. A former coworker of Emily's forwarded me a chain of messages from her office chat where colleagues whispered about the anonymous package and the ugly side of the woman they once admired. Her polished facade was cracking, and the sound of it echoed louder than her laughter ever had. For years, Emily had been untouchable, the golden child, the one everyone defended, the one whose failures were brushed aside while my successes were ignored. But now her own words were out in the open, stripped of context, stripped of excuses. They revealed her not as a victim, not as a star, but as a manipulator who had built her life on exploiting others and mocking those who helped her. I didn't need to raise my voice or confront her face to face. The evidence spoke for me. The packages, the recordings, the carefully baited email, these were my voice, louder than any argument I could make. And they were enough to begin the collapse of her carefully guarded image. For the first time, Emily couldn't hide behind charm or crocodile tears. The mirror was held up, and she had no choice but to see what she really was. The golden child's crown was cracking, by her own words. The fallout from the packages I had sent was swift and brutal. Emily's colleagues whispered behind her back. Her in-laws confronted her with documents that bore her own words, and the golden child's crown was slipping faster than she could patch it. I thought the silence that followed would be telling, that my parents would retreat into shock, unable to deny what had been exposed. Instead, the silence broke one evening with the shrill ring of my phone, and on the other end were the voices I knew all too well, rising and falling like a storm that couldn't decide if it wanted to drown me in tears or strike me with lightning. My mother's voice came first, high-pitched and furious, spitting words like venom. "What have you done to your sister? You've always been jealous, Laura, but this is monstrous. You've ruined her life, her marriage, her career." In the background, I heard my father's lower, steadier tone, but no less poisonous. "You think you're clever, destroying your own family for revenge? Everyone sees you for what you are now. A bitter woman who can't stand Emily's happiness." The accusations poured through the receiver in rapid succession. They painted me as the villain, twisting every truth I had exposed into a narrative where I was the envious younger sister, incapable of joy for anyone else. I sat there listening, my jaw tight, my heart beating steady, and for once I didn't rush to defend myself. For years I had tried to argue, to prove, to explain. Now I let their words wash over me like a tide I no longer feared. When rage didn't get the reaction they wanted, the performance shifted. My mother's voice cracked heavy with forced sobs. Do you know what you've done to this family? Emily hasn't stopped crying. She's broken Laura, and it's your fault. You've destroyed the bond of sisters forever. I raised you better than this. Family should protect family, not tear it apart. She sniffled loudly, pausing for effect, waiting for me to feel the old pangs of guilt. Then my father cut in, his voice sharp as a whip. If you don't stop this nonsense, we will disown you. You'll never step foot in this family again. We'll tell everyone you're unstable, vindictive, cruel. You'll regret turning against us. His threats were as familiar as Lullaby's words they had used for years to keep me in line, but this time I wasn't the scared child or the desperate daughter waiting for approval. Their alternating tactics became almost laughable in their predictability. Rage to break me down, guilt to make me bend threats to force compliance. It was the same cycle they had always relied on. But the difference now was that I had evidence I had power, and most importantly, I had stopped caring about their approval. Every word they flung at me only confirmed the truth I had finally allowed myself to believe. They didn't love me as their daughter. They loved me as their resource, their scapegoat, their invisible support system. I let the storm rage for a few minutes, listening to their voices trip over each other in anger and desperation. And then, when there was finally a pause, I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, cutting through their chaos like a blade. You already disowned me at the wedding, I said. The moment you told me I wasn't family, you made your choice. Don't pretend this is about love or loyalty. This is about losing control, and you can't stand it. The silence on the other end was deafening. For a moment, I imagined them staring at each other, realizing I was no longer the daughter they could manipulate with tears or threats. I didn't wait for a response. I pressed the button and ended the call, cutting their voices out of my life like severing a rotten branch from a tree. For the first time after one of their outbursts, I didn't feel drained or guilty. I felt strong. My hands didn't tremble, my heart didn't race. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I had spoken the truth aloud, a truth they couldn't deny no matter how they tried to rewrite the story. They had cast me out long before I fought back. All I had done was make it official. I set my phone down and stared out the window at the city lights. Their world was collapsing piece by piece, and they were scrambling to blame me for the wreckage. But I knew better. They had built that house of cards, and all I had done was expose the draft that had always been there. This was not the end of the story. Their rage was just the opening act of something far larger. This was only the overture. The phone call I ended with my parents still echoed in my mind when the next strike fell, not from me this time, but from the system I had set in motion. A few days later, they were served with the official lawsuit papers. I wasn't there to see it happen, but I pictured the scene vividly, a knock on the door, my mother's expectant face, as she thought perhaps it was a neighbor or a delivery, only to find a uniformed officer handing over an envelope with their names printed in bold. I imagined my father's voice rising in protest, demanding to know what this was even as he tore open the seal and saw the words he feared most. They were being sued by their own daughter. When my lawyer called to confirm the delivery, I felt a sharp rush of adrenaline. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about accountability. They had ignored me for years, dismissed me, belittled me, drained me, but now they would have to answer not to me alone, but to a court of law. No amount of tears or excuses would erase the signatures and numbers written across those pages. For the first time in my life, justice had a weight heavier than their voices. Their reaction came swiftly, as I knew it would. Instead of silence or direct confrontation, they tried a new tactic, one as transparent as it was insulting. A letter arrived at my apartment tucked in a cream-colored envelope that looked deliberately chosen to evoke warmth and nostalgia. Inside was a note that pretended to be a heartfelt plea for reconciliation. Laura, we have always loved you. It began, we may have made mistakes, but family is about forgiveness, about standing together through the hardest times. There were even copies of old photographs folded into the envelope, pictures of me as a child blowing out birthday candles of Emily and me, side by side in matching dresses of my parents holding us close. It was a performance on paper staged as carefully as any of Emily's social media posts, but as soon as I scanned the page, I noticed the flaw. The handwriting. It wasn't my father's slanted print or my mother's looping cursive. It was Emily's. Her neat, careful style leapt off the page, betraying the entire charade. She had written the letter for them, hoping I would believe it was from both parents, hoping to manipulate me into a moment of weakness. I laughed, bitter and cold. Even now, even after the evidence, even after the lawsuit, their instinct was not to be honest, but to collude in yet another lie. They thought they could disguise desperation as love, but I knew their patterns too well. I didn't respond. Instead, I tucked the letter into my growing file of evidence, labeling it not as correspondence, but as proof. Proof that their so-called unity was nothing but smoke and mirrors hastily assembled and easy to tear apart. My lawyer agreed. This shows intent, he said, an attempt to manipulate you outside of court. Judges don't look kindly on that. The silence that followed the letter told me what was happening behind closed doors. They were unraveling. My parents were probably furious that Emily's writing had betrayed them, blaming her for the failure of their scheme. Emily, in turn, was likely berating them for being careless for letting the situation spiral this far in the first place. The alliance that had once been so solid, parents and golden child united in their favoritism, was showing its fractures. For the first time, they weren't just turning their cruelty outward toward me. They were turning it on each other. I didn't need to eavesdrop to know what those arguments sounded like. My father's gruff accusations, my mother's tearful defenses, Emily's sharp retorts, each voice pointing fingers, each one convinced the others were to blame. They had always built their power on presenting a united front, but now that facade was cracking. The truth was too heavy to carry together, and each one was scrambling to drop it onto the other's shoulders. I sat in my apartment, the city lights glowing beyond my window, and I realized something monumental. I didn't have to lift another finger for their destruction to continue. They were doing the work themselves. The lawsuit had set the stage, and their own lies were pulling the curtain down. What they had once used to control me, guilt, unity, manipulation, was now imploding under the weight of their desperation. I poured myself a glass of wine, savoring the quiet, and allowed myself to imagine what would come next. They had been served. They had tried to deceive me with a fake letter. And now they were tearing themselves apart inside that house they were about to lose. For decades, I had been the shadow in the corner, the silent one left out of the family circle. But now it was their turn to be shadows of the family they once pretended to be. Their fake unity was about to shatter. The day they were served with the lawsuit papers had already rattled the walls of their world, but what came afterward was something I had both expected and quietly savored. Word traveled quickly in our community, and not because I broadcasted anything. Public records did that work for me. Court filings were available to anyone curious enough to search, and in our small New Jersey suburb, curiosity was practically a pastime. Neighbors began whispering about the lawsuit against my parents, connecting dots that had always seemed slightly out of place. I overheard one woman at the local grocery store speaking in hushed tones, as though she were passing on state secrets, saying, "Did you hear the Thompsons have been living off their daughter all these years? She finally took them to court." Another voice responded with shock that was laced with judgment. I knew something was off. Always flaunting that house, but never seemed to have real jobs. Figures. The whispers weren't confined to supermarkets or church pews. They seeped into the very air of the neighborhood. Curtains twitched more often when my parents walked to the mailbox. Longtime acquaintances who once waved with neighborly warmth now crossed the street or turned their backs, unwilling to exchange even polite greetings. That's how quickly respect can evaporate when the truth is revealed. It wasn't just neighbors, though. Their so-called friends, people they had entertained at backyard barbecues or hosted for Christmas dinners, began to vanish. Invitations stopped coming. Weekly bridge nights and dinner parties ceased to include them, and it wasn't from scheduling conflicts. It was deliberate exclusion. One of my mother's closest friends, a woman she had known since high school, stopped returning calls altogether. My mother left increasingly frantic voicemails, her voice growing more shrill with each message. "Please, it's not true the way Laura makes it sound. You know me. You know our family. Call me back." But the calls went unanswered. I didn't need to hear those voicemails to know what was happening. People weren't interested in aligning themselves with scandal. In communities like ours, reputation is currency, and theirs had collapsed like a poorly built house in a storm. The distance grew sharper with Emily. She who once strutted proudly through her book club and workout groups found herself quietly erased. Group chats went silent when she entered the room. Invitations to meetings were suddenly forgotten. Even casual acquaintances who once flattered her on social media went mute, likes and comments drying up overnight. Her so-called friends now pretended not to see her when they passed in town. To them, she was no longer the glamorous golden child, but the embodiment of deceit and humiliation. Emily's face told the story even before she opened her mouth. The exhaustion, the anger barely concealed beneath the surface, the way she clutched her phone like a lifeline, yet found no one answering her messages. She had built her entire social identity on being admired, envied, elevated. Without that pedestal, she was adrift, and the void terrified her. For my parents, the silence was louder than any direct confrontation could have been. They had been the kind of couple who thrived on social standing, who attended every community fundraiser, every wedding, every funeral, always dressed well and ready to project an image of dignity. But one by one, those invitations ceased. Church groups politely suggested they take time for themselves. Neighbors who used to stop for coffee made excuses about busy schedules. Even the pastor who once praised them for raising 2 daughters with strong values avoided eye contact. The shift was subtle at first, but it grew so stark that even they could not deny it. They had been dethroned not by scandalous rumors, but by truth laid bare in legal filings and whispered in living rooms. I didn't have to lift a finger. I didn't send anonymous emails. I didn't spread gossip myself. The truth alone was enough to strip them bare. And maybe that was the most satisfying part. For years I had been invisible in that community, the overlooked daughter whose achievements meant little, whose presence barely registered. Now I was the silent force behind their unraveling. It wasn't about revenge in the form of fireworks or public speeches. It was about watching a lifetime of false pride crumble under the weight of facts that could no longer be ignored. At night, I sometimes wondered how they were enduring the isolation. Did my mother sit at her kitchen table staring at a phone that never rang? Did my father, once so quick to brag about Emily's supposed brilliance, now struggle to meet his neighbor's eyes? And Emily did. She still scrolled through her contacts, hoping for validation, only to see silence stretch endlessly before her. The irony was almost poetic. They had cast me out long ago, deciding I wasn't worthy of the family circle. And now, by their own choices, they found themselves cast out from every circle they had ever relied on. The community, once their stage, had closed its curtains on them. Their small world was shrinking, and they had nowhere left to turn. Every door they had once confidently walked through was slamming shut one by one, leaving only echoes of the life they had lost. Every door in their small world was closing. It didn't take long after the whispers began in the neighborhood for the poison to seep into Emily's carefully constructed world. I had been waiting for it, watching from the distance I had learned to cultivate when the first crack appeared. One of Emily's co-workers, someone she had bragged about pushing around in meetings, filed an anonymous tip to HR. They attached a recording one I had quietly placed in the right inbox that captured her laughing about milking my sister for cash and mocking the very generosity that had once kept her afloat. The voice was unmistakably hers. When she was called into her manager's office, I can only imagine the smug confidence she carried with her, believing she could charm her way out like she always had with my parents. But this wasn't our parents' living room. This was a corporation with a reputation to protect, and Emily's arrogance was no longer an asset. By the end of that meeting, she was holding a cardboard box filled with her belongings, escorted out by security in full view of colleagues she used to sneer at. I heard about it through the same channels she once used to parade her supposed triumphs. Her fall spread fast. LinkedIn updates went silent, group chats erupted with gossip, and former colleagues who had endured her bullying privately admitted they felt relief. It wasn't just a termination, it was a public stripping away of her professional mask. She had always lived for appearances, and now those appearances were crumbling under her feet. But the true blow came from home, not the office. David, her husband, had been simmering with suspicion since the truth about the wedding funding began to surface. He had tolerated her half-truths, her melodramatic performances, even her manipulations. But the bank statements and emails he eventually pieced together painted a damning picture. Emily hadn't just lied about who funded their wedding. She had hidden debts, siphoned off money, and passed them off as family obligations. When the HR scandal broke, it was the final confirmation that her character wasn't a matter of misunderstanding. It was deception through and through. David filed for divorce almost immediately, citing fraudulent misrepresentation of finances and breach of trust. In black and white in court papers, her own husband essentially declared her unfit to share a life with. The divorce was brutal, not just because it stripped Emily of her role as wife, but because it publicly documented her lies. Court records don't hide easily. David's lawyers moved swiftly, presenting evidence of her financial misconduct and even referencing the recordings that had cost her job. To him, she wasn't a partner anymore. She was a liability, one he was determined to cut loose before she dragged him further down. She had dreamed of parading around as the picture-perfect wife with her handsome, successful husband at her side. Instead, she was being reduced to legal paperwork, her reputation shredded in two different arenas at once. I imagine the shame of those days was unbearable. Emily had always been the golden child, the one polished and put on a pedestal while I stood ignored in her shadow. And now that pedestal was cracking, collapsing under the weight of her own arrogance. For once, she was the one being discarded, and the irony was almost poetic. When the divorce papers were signed and the HR dismissal finalized, Emily found herself with nowhere left to go. Her friends had distanced themselves. After all, who wants to be associated with someone whose name had become synonymous with fraud and manipulation? David kept their shared home, leaving her no claim to the life she had envisioned. And so, with no job, no marriage, and no allies, she did the one thing I had predicted all along. She went back to our parents' house. The same house that was teetering on the edge of foreclosure, the same house I was in the process of claiming through legal means, became her last refuge. She dragged her suitcases into that space, stripped of everything but bitterness and excuses. She hadn't just lost her job and her husband, she had lost the illusion that she was untouchable. From a distance, I could see the picture forming, the once proud family unit, the alliance that had worked tirelessly to push me down, now forced back together under the weight of disgrace. My parents, already drowning in debt and humiliation, now had their golden daughter returned to them not as a triumph, but as another burden. She hadn't returned with success stories or accolades. She had returned with nothing but failure, debt, and shame. It was exactly as I had expected, though still startling in its completeness. Emily had always believed she could bend reality, that she could talk her way into admiration and out of consequences. But consequences once set in motion are merciless. She had mocked me for being too serious, too cautious, too bookish. Now, those very qualities, the discipline, the caution, the willingness to face reality, were what gave me power, while her delusions left her empty-handed. I didn't need to raise a finger. The walls had closed in on her without me lifting more than a whisper in the right ear, more than a single document slipped into the right folder. Watching her stumble back into the very house she once weaponized against me felt like justice served. And yet, it was only the beginning. Because what she brought back with her wasn't just failure, it was the start of the family's implosion from within. The family that united against me was now devouring itself. They say pride is the last thing to die, but watching my parents claw at scraps of a life they had once built on my back, I realized even pride has a price tag. After Emily had been fired and her marriage disintegrated, The three of them were pressed together in that sagging old house surrounded by bills and silence. I heard through a neighbor and later confirmed through my attorney that they began selling anything they could pry loose. The irony was bitter and sweet. At once furniture I had helped them buy when I was younger, jewelry that had once been flaunted at family gatherings, and even gifts I had given them over the years. A silver watch I purchased for my father with my first real paycheck was marked at $10 on a folding table in their driveway. The thought made me laugh, though it also stung in a place I didn't expect. That watch had once symbolized hope, a foolish belief that love could be bought with effort. Now it was just another trinket in their garage sale of desperation. The spiral didn't stop there. Word reached me that my uncle, the one relative who had always hovered on the edge of things, careful never to intervene, stepped in briefly. He had promised them a loan enough to cover a few mortgage payments and maybe keep the collectors at bay. My parents clung to that promise like drowning people grabbing a floating branch. They told neighbors that things were turning around, that family sticks together. What they didn't realize was that my attorney had already contacted him privately. My uncle, a cautious man with an eye for self-preservation, didn't need much convincing. Once he understood the depth of the fraud they had committed against me, he withdrew his offer quietly. The branch snapped. They were left flailing in deeper waters than before. I had orchestrated that moment not with cruelty for cruelty's sake, but to remind them that their false hopes were only illusions propped up by lies. Then came the garage sale. I drove by once, not stopping, not announcing myself. Just enough to see. Rows of clothes hung limply on metal racks. Photo albums with broken spines piled in boxes being flipped through by strangers with idle curiosity. My mother stood behind a card table, eyes hollow, bargaining over nickels. My father hunched in a lawn chair staring at his shoes, while a neighbor offered $1 for the family's old china set. Emily was there too, her hair pulled back without care, snapping at people who offered too little for the once prized decorations of her wedding. The humiliation was complete. Neighbors whispered, shaking their heads, some muttering that they had suspected all along that things weren't as perfect as my parents had bragged. Their empire of appearances had collapsed into a circus of bargains. What struck me most was how quickly those who had once praised them melted away. I heard whispers that no one wanted to buy their things, not because they were worthless, but because they carried the stench of shame. The whole neighborhood treated them like a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. My parents, who had strutted through block parties boasting of Emily's talents and dismissing my accomplishments now, had to stand silent while their life was picked apart like carrion by the curious eyes of people they had once tried to impress. I kept my distance, but the image stayed with me. It was almost biblical, like a parable about greed and arrogance, and I was both the author and the witness. I knew they must have thought salvation was near when my uncle's promise came. They must have felt a flicker of pride when they set up that garage sale, telling themselves it was temporary, that they would recover. But it was never about the items on those tables or the money slipping through their hands. It was about dignity, and they had sold that off long before. I had seen it clearly the moment they chose Emily's comfort over my worth, the moment they took my $35,000 and locked me out of the very wedding I had funded. That was the day they pawned their dignity for good. Now the world was simply forcing them to collect the debt. I didn't pity them as I once might have. I didn't ache the way I did when I was 16 and realized they had used my name to buy a car for Emily. I was past pity, past longing. What I felt was a cold, sharp clarity. They had built their world on illusions, and I had finally learned how to strip those illusions away. Watching them bargain over broken furniture was only the surface of the punishment. The true torment was the realization settling over them that no rescue was coming, not from me, not from anyone. Their salvation was illusion, and I had set the trap. The day the foreclosure notice went up, it was like the final nail hammered into a coffin everyone had been pretending wasn't there. My attorney had kept me updated, but nothing compared to the reality of it being plastered on their front door in bright, merciless ink. 30 days. That was all they had before the bank claimed what they had called their pride, their castle, their proof of success. The same house they had flaunted at holidays, parading Emily as if she were royalty within those walls, while I was made to feel like a guest in a place I had partially paid for. Now the lie was written out for the whole street to see, and there was no hiding behind curtains or smiles anymore. I didn't have to imagine the humiliation. The neighborhood was buzzing with it. Neighbors whispered to one another on front lawns and driveways, their voices carrying through the suburban quiet. I knew the whispers, because I had once been on the receiving end of them when my parents would bend the truth to make me sound ungrateful or distant. Now the roles had flipped. People crossed the street to avoid awkward eye contact with my mother, or stopped by only to gawk at the notice taped to the door. I could picture her stiff-backed and trembling, pulling at the edges of that paper as if tearing it down would erase the truth. But the glue of reality is stronger than any tape. As the deadline crept closer, the house began to empty piece by piece. First the garage filled with boxes, then the yard. Furniture that had stood for decades was carried out and set down on the curb like broken bones exposed under the judgmental stares of passers-by. Sofas, mattresses, chipped tables, all once symbols of family stability, now lay like carcasses waiting for scavengers. Even their wedding china, the one my mother had always bragged about keeping for special occasions, was stacked in cardboard boxes marked with fading Sharpie. People walked by slowly, some picking through with curiosity, others shaking their heads with thinly veiled satisfaction. There's a cruelty in communities when one of their own falls from grace, and my parents were learning just how sharp that cruelty could be. I drove by only once, careful to remain unseen. The sight was worse than I expected. My father was slumped in a lawn chair, staring at the ground as if willing it to swallow him whole. His hands hung loose at his sides, palms up like even gravity had abandoned him. My mother moved aimlessly between piles, her face pale, her hands wringing a dish towel she must have grabbed without thinking. Every so often she would stop and touch something, a lamp or a picture frame, and then drop it again, as though the weight burned her fingers. There was no shouting between them anymore, no posturing, just silence. It was the silence of surrender of people who finally knew they had lost. I thought of all the years I had stepped into that house with cautious hope, always wishing to feel warmth and belonging, always leaving with emptiness. I remembered the times I had watched Emily celebrated at the dining table while my own achievements went unnoticed. That house had never been mine, no matter how much I contributed to keep it standing. They had barred me from its heart long ago when they chose to treat me as a means to an end rather than as their daughter. Now it was betraying them too, and I couldn't help but feel that it was justice unfolding in slow, merciless strokes. The day the sheriff arrived to oversee the eviction, the street filled with onlookers. Cars slowed down, children peeked out of windows. Neighbors stood in small clusters whispering. The spectacle was complete. Movers carried the last of the furniture to the curb under the watchful eye of uniformed authority. My father sat in the yard, unmoving, a hollow man in a collapsing world. My mother clutched the house key in her hand like a relic, pressing it to her chest, before finally breaking into sobs that racked her thin frame. I knew she wasn't crying over the loss of shelter. She was mourning the image, the illusion of superiority they had guarded so fiercely for decades. That illusion was now gone, scattered across the grass and sidewalk for all to see. I stayed in my car a few streets away, watching from a distance. There was no need for me to step closer. They wouldn't have seen me anyway, not really. They never had. All I needed was to bear witness to the unraveling of the empire they built on my sacrifices and lies. It was both pitiful and poetic. They had once told me I wasn't family, shutting me out of celebrations, locking me away from the warmth of belonging. Now the house that had been their fortress against me had turned its back on them, too, exposing every rotten board and crack in the foundation. The eviction ended with the movers gone, the sheriff driving away, and my parents left standing amid the ruins of their pride. My mother dropped the key into the grass, too weak to hold it any longer, and walked away with shoulders hunched. My father didn't move. He sat there in the fading light like a statue of failure, and for the first time I felt nothing but clarity. The cycle was complete. They had used me to protect that house, to preserve its image, to uphold their false pride. But in the end, they couldn't protect it from themselves. Justice didn't come in a roar. It came in a whisper carried by the wind through an empty yard over broken furniture and shattered dreams. The house would never shelter them again. The collapse of the house should have been the lowest point for my parents. But for Emily, the final blow came in the form of a courtroom and a signature. I followed the divorce proceedings through public filings and occasional updates from my attorney, who seemed almost amused at how quickly her fairy tale unraveled. Just months before Emily had walked down an aisle lined with roses in an $8,000 dress I had unknowingly paid for. She had smiled like a queen, basking in the admiration of guests who whispered about her beauty, her future, her perfect life. Now, in the sterile glow of a courthouse, she sat hunched and pale while a judge stamped the documents that dissolved her marriage. The fairy tale had rotted into a cautionary tale, and the ink made it final. David had been patient, but his patience had a limit. When he filed for divorce, he cited fraudulent misrepresentation of finances, a phrase that looked cold on paper, but carried the full weight of Emily's lies. It was there in black and white for anyone who searched public records to see. She had built her marriage the same way my parents had built their household, on deception, manipulation, and appearances. And just like them, she discovered that appearances crumble when tested by reality. There was no spousal support, no alimony, no equitable division of assets. Emily walked away with nothing but debts and her tarnished name. The humiliation didn't end in the courtroom. Public records are cruelly democratic. Anyone can read them. Neighbors whispered about the case. Friends forwarded links to one another with incredulous comments. Even strangers with too much time on their hands found her name in searchable databases and passed judgment. Fraud leaves a stain that doesn't wash out, and Emily's stain spread faster than she could contain it. But the most devastating blow came not from legal papers or gossip, but from David himself. At their wedding, he had delivered a speech that many of the guests had recorded on their phones. It had been full of warmth at the time, words about loyalty, honesty, and building a future together. After the divorce filing, someone uploaded the video to social media with a biting caption, "When you think you're marrying honesty but end up with fraud." The video went viral in days. Millions of people watched David's smiling face speak words that now sounded ironic, even tragic. The comments section was brutal. Strangers mocked Emily as though they had known her all their lives, dissecting her lies, pointing out her hypocrisy. Emily had once been envied by everyone. She was the golden child, the one who had it all, the family's adoration, the lavish wedding, the dream husband. Now she was reduced to a meme, a punchline for jokes about liars and manipulators. I didn't need to gloat. The world was doing it for me. I imagined her sitting in her childhood bedroom, the same room my parents had redecorated countless times for her comfort, while I was left to make do with hand-me-downs, scrolling through the endless stream of cruel comments. Her perfect image was gone. The friends who had toasted her happiness were now silent or worse, gleeful in their distance. The husband who had once held her hand in front of 200 people now wanted nothing to do with her. And I, the sister she had shut out, didn't need to lift a finger. Her downfall was complete and public, more visible than any punishment I could have orchestrated alone. When I thought back to the day she stood on that stage in her dress, declaring herself free from my shadow, I couldn't help but marvel at the irony. She had been free only for a moment. The shadow she feared so much wasn't mine. It was her own lies, and they had finally consumed her. The envied bride now had nothing. When Emily's divorce became official and the internet turned her into a spectacle, I thought perhaps that would be the end of it. I thought the weight of public shame would finally quiet them, that they would retreat into the shadows where they had long since pushed me. But desperation makes people shameless, and I learned that when they appeared one morning in the most unthinkable place, the marble lobby of my corporate office in Manhattan. I had just stepped out of a black car, coffee in one hand, and my laptop bag in the other, bracing myself for another demanding day as senior manager. The lobby was already humming with the rush of professionals' heels clicking against polished floors, voices blending into the soundscape of ambition. And then, like a grotesque scene from a nightmare, I saw them. My parents and Emily kneeling right in the middle of the open space, their clothes wrinkled, their faces pale, their bodies bowed low on the stone that reflected the morning sun. The entire lobby froze. Phones came out in unison, screens raised to record the bizarre tableau. Whispers grew into murmurs, into outright comments. People were asking one another, "Who are they? Why are they here?" The shame I had endured silently for decades was now laid bare in the heart of my professional world where my colleagues and subordinates could see. But the shame wasn't mine this time. It belonged to them. My mother clutched a folded piece of paper in her hand, and when she saw me, she stumbled forward on her knees, thrusting it toward me like it was some sacred offering. "Laura," she cried, her voice echoing against the marble, "please, read this. It's our confession, everything we did wrong. We're begging you." I didn't need to open the paper to know what it was. Even from a few feet away, I recognized the formatting, the careful phrasing. It wasn't a confession at all. It was the same letter Emily had written months earlier when she was trying to salvage her marriage with David, slightly altered and repurposed for this new performance. The same words recycled again, as if sincerity could be copied and pasted, as if forgiveness could be manufactured like a script. Emily herself knelt beside them, her face streaked with mascara, her hands trembling as she held them out to me like a child begging for candy. "Please, Laura," she sobbed, her voice breaking on every syllable. "You're all we have left. Help us. Forgive us. We'll do anything." The crowd watched in silence, some wide-eyed, some whispering to one another, some holding their phones higher to capture every humiliating second. In that moment, I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel rage. What I felt was power, cold, undeniable power that came not from shouting or striking back, but from choosing not to respond at all. For years I had been forced into silence, my pain ignored, my voice dismissed. Now silence was my weapon, and it was louder than any words I could have spoken. I looked at them once, letting my gaze pass over the bent forms of my parents and the broken shell of my sister. I let the silence stretch long enough for them to hope, long enough for them to believe I might bend, that I might reach out, that I might forgive. And then, without a word, I turned. My heels clicked against the floor as I walked toward the elevator. The sound was sharp, echoing a steady rhythm that cut through the whispers like a drumbeat. I pressed the button, the doors slid open, and I stepped inside. As the elevator began to close, I caught one last glimpse of them through the narrowing gap, my mother sobbing into her hands, my father staring blankly at the ground, Emily with her arms still outstretched as though she could grasp me if she tried hard enough. Behind them, the phones kept recording, capturing every humiliating detail for an audience far larger than the one in that lobby. I didn't say a single word. I didn't need to. My silence was their loudest condemnation. The morning after the scene in my corporate lobby was plastered across social media, I received a call from my uncle, the one relative who had always been cordial, though never particularly close. His voice was measured, but I could sense the tension beneath it. He said the family needed to meet an intervention of sorts, though this time it wasn't for me. It was to address the years of damage my parents and Emily had inflicted, not just on me, but on the reputation of the family name. I agreed, though my stomach knotted at the idea of facing a room filled with people who had so often turned a blind eye to the favoritism I endured growing up. Still, I knew the time had come to lay everything bare. The meeting was held in a quiet banquet room at a modest restaurant in New Jersey, halfway between the city where I built my life and the suburban sprawl where most of them still lived. When I walked in, every eye turned toward me. Some carried guilt, some pity, and a few even carried a trace of curiosity, as if they were finally ready to hear the story they had ignored for so long. My parents and Emily sat huddled together at the far end of the room, their faces tight, as though the world had shrunk in on them. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't waste time. I pulled a thick binder from my bag and placed it on the table. It was organized chronologically, each tab marking a year, each section filled with bank transfers, credit card statements, and text messages I had saved. I explained how over more than a decade I had covered car repairs tuition that never existed, vacations disguised as emergencies, and medical bills inflated or fabricated outright. I showed records of the credit accounts opened in my name, the loans Emily had co-signed under false pretenses, and the steady drain of money that had amounted to 6 figures taken from me under the guise of family obligation. The room fell silent as I flipped through the pages. Some of my cousins looked stunned. Others whispered in disbelief. I could feel the weight of their attention pressing down, but I stayed steady. I wanted no pity. I wanted clarity. When I paused, my uncle, the one who had called this gathering, rose from his seat. He cleared his throat and spoke with the kind of gravity that silenced every rustle and cough. He told the room that years ago he had privately urged my parents to treat me more fairly, to recognize the imbalance that everyone could see, but no one wanted to confront. He admitted he had warned them that their favoritism would tear the family apart. But my parents had laughed it off, telling him he didn't understand that Emily was destined for greatness, and I was fine on my own. His words now carried the sharp edge of vindication, though I could also hear regret for not pressing harder. My mother sputtered in protest, insisting I had misunderstood their intentions, while my father sat stone-faced, his jaw clenched as if grinding down years of denial. Emily muttered something about jealousy, but her voice was thin, shaky, stripped of the confidence she once flaunted. The other relatives, however, had heard enough. One by one, they voiced their disapproval. An aunt shook her head and said she was ashamed to have ignored the obvious. A cousin said she remembered birthday parties where I sat quietly in the corner, overshadowed by Emily's dramatics, and how she now realized those moments weren't just childish rivalry, they were symptoms of a deeper rot. The family consensus became clear: my parents and Emily had exploited me for years, and the time had come to cut them off completely. Then came the final blow. My uncle announced that after consulting with other relatives, they had decided my parents and Emily would be excluded from the family trust fund. The money meant to ensure future generations had a safety net would no longer be accessible to them. They had proven themselves untrustworthy stewards of both resources and relationships. The announcement landed like a gavel striking wood. My parents' faces drained of color. Emily gasped audibly, whispering frantic protests to no one who would listen. I sat there calm, not triumphant, but resolute. I had not orchestrated this meeting to humiliate them, though humiliation was inevitable. I had done it to show the truth, to ensure that the lies they spun for decades would no longer shield them from accountability. As the meeting adjourned, relatives filed past me with quiet nods of support, some touching my arm or offering brief apologies for their silence in the past. I accepted their gestures without bitterness. I had long since stopped expecting validation from others. My parents and Emily sat frozen in their chairs, surrounded yet completely alone. In that moment, I realized something they had always believed: blood was their ultimate defense, the final rope they could tug to keep themselves from falling. But now that rope had been cut. The people they had assumed would always shield them had turned away, leaving them exposed. They had no blood left to call on. When my extended family finally turned their backs on my parents and Emily, I thought that would be the end of their humiliation. I thought the worst they could face was being cut out of the trust fund, shunned by people who once defended them. But the truth is, that was only the beginning. The world outside the family circle had begun to take notice, and once the story broke into the community, it spread faster than any of us could have imagined. What had once been whispered in living rooms and kitchens now spilled into the open, plastered across social media for everyone to see. It started with a single Facebook post in the local neighborhood group. Someone had uploaded photos of my parents' eviction and their belongings stacked on the curb, along with a caption that read, "When greed eats its own, they took from their daughter until she took it all back." I didn't write it, but I didn't have to. The truth had legs of its own. Within hours, the post had gathered hundreds of comments. By the next morning, there were over 500. I read them all one by one, sipping my coffee as the sun rose over the Hudson. People expressed outrage, disgust, and disbelief. "How could parents do that to their child?" one person wrote. "This is unforgivable," said another. The consensus was clear. The tide of public opinion was no longer in their favor if it ever had been. And there I was, watching the avalanche bury them in shame, not needing to lift a finger. The comments cut deeper than anything I could have said myself. Neighbors who used to wave at my parents from across the fence now wrote, "We always wondered why Laura looked so sad growing up. Now we know." Old acquaintances chimed in with their own stories of having been manipulated by my family, painting a picture of exploitation that extended far beyond me. It became a public reckoning, one my parents and Emily could not control no matter how desperately they tried to deny or spin the narrative. Their words meant nothing against the tide of collective judgment. Emily, who once prided herself on being admired, felt the humiliation in ways my parents couldn't even comprehend. She had tried in the aftermath of her divorce to put herself back out there. Dating apps had become her lifeline, her desperate attempt to rebuild some shred of her former image. But in the digital age, nothing stays hidden. Screenshots of her profile's glossy selfies paired with carefully worded bios were quickly discovered and circulated. People mocked her openly. Comments like, "Isn't this the girl who stole thousands from her sister?" and "Swipe left on the gold digger" trailed her like a shadow she couldn't escape. The cruelest part was that she had once mocked me for being alone, for not catching a husband before 30. Now she was the one shamed and ridiculed publicly, her prospects shrinking with every viral thread. I didn't laugh, though. I didn't need to. There was a cold satisfaction in knowing that the truth had followed her where her lies once flourished. She had wanted freedom from my shadow, but what she found instead was the glaring spotlight of exposure. Every attempt to rebuild her image crumbled under the weight of what the world now knew. Even the church, the one place my parents thought they could still find refuge, turned against them. For decades, they had attended services, sitting proudly in the front pews, performing piety like actors on a stage. They thought their standing in that community would save them. But word spreads quickly in tight-knit congregations. One Sunday, the pastor delivered a sermon that cut straight through their last illusion of dignity. He spoke about favoritism, about neglect, about the duty of parents to love all their children equally. And then he told a story without names, but everyone recognized it instantly, about a family who exploited one daughter to elevate another until they lost everything. I wasn't there, but several people sent me recordings of the sermon. My parents had sat in their usual place, staring at the floor as the words sank in. The congregation's eyes were on them, and I imagined the shame burned hotter than any fire they had ever felt. By then, they couldn't leave the house without feeling the weight of 100 stares. The grocery store clerk who used to chat with them now kept conversations short. The barista at the local cafe, once friendly, turned cold. Children whispered to each other in line, pointing at Emily like she was a character from a cautionary tale. Their names had become synonymous with betrayal, greed, and disgrace. And all of it happened without me saying a word. I didn't have to orchestrate their downfall anymore. The world was doing it for me. I could have stopped there. I could have said, "Justice has been served," and walked away. Many people would have. But as I sat in my apartment watching their downfall play out in real time across screens and through whispered reports, I knew I wasn't finished. Because while they had lost their reputation, their money, and their community, they still had something I wanted to take from them, the illusion that they could ever crawl back into my life, that forgiveness might someday be possible if they played the right card. That illusion had to be crushed completely. And I was the only one who could do it. But I wasn't finished yet. After the fallout with the extended family and the humiliation that spread across social media, I thought perhaps they would try to hide to keep their disgrace contained within closed doors. But disgrace has a way of seeping into every crack, and soon it was clear they had no doors left to close. With the house gone and no relatives willing to step in, the three of them, my parents and Emily, slipped into a new kind of existence. I began to hear whispers through acquaintances and coworkers who lived in the suburbs, near where my parents once held their heads high. They weren't in a home anymore. They were in motels, the kind where the air smells of bleach and cigarettes, where the lights flicker in the hallway and the carpets are stained with years of despair. They shuffled from one to the next, carrying their belongings in black garbage bags, the image of transience painted across every step. For people who once prided themselves on appearances, it was the perfect undoing. Emily especially had been a master of appearances. She was the sister who wouldn't walk into a grocery store without her makeup done, who insisted on designer labels even when she couldn't afford them. She used to sneer at people who wore last season's shoes. Now I heard her hair hung limp and unwashed. Her once flawless manicure was chipped to the quick, and her clothes' wrinkled thrift store remnants made her look like a ghost of herself. If anyone had shown her a mirror from a year ago and compared it to now, I think she would have screamed. But this was her reflection, not mine. This was the reality she and my parents had earned. One evening, on my way back from a client meeting in Jersey, I took the long route home. Some part of me wanted to see it with my own eyes, and there they were outside a budget motel just off the highway. My mother was dragging a trash bag heavier than she could carry, stumbling while my father barked at her to move faster. Emily sat on the curb, head bowed, her makeup streaked like war paint from tears. She looked up for the briefest moment, and our eyes met through the windshield. For a second, I wondered if she would recognize me, if she would run to the car like she once ran to me when she needed money. But she didn't move. She looked away ashamed, as though even acknowledging me would deepen her humiliation. I slowed just enough to take in the full scene, and then I pressed the accelerator. I felt nothing but the sharp taste of justice. The contrast between their misery and my life was not lost on me. I drove past them in my Tesla, the hum of the electric engine so quiet compared to the noise of their downfall. In my trunk was a bottle of wine I had bought for myself, a small indulgence after a long week of work. I thought about how not long ago I had been their safety net, their invisible bank account with legs. Now without me, they were adrift, and the garbage bags at their feet were proof of how temporary everything they had built on my sacrifices truly was. My father used to brag to neighbors about the house as if it were his castle. My mother used to show off Emily's clothes as if they were symbols of superiority. And now they had nothing but plastic bags and cheap motel sheets. I will admit there was a pang of memory as I watched my mother struggle with that bag. For a split second, the child in me wanted to step out to help to lift that weight from her shoulders. But then I remembered all the times she had watched me carry burdens no child should carry: debts, shame, loneliness, while she turned her eyes to Emily's fabricated triumphs. That pang dissolved into steel. I had helped enough. I had carried enough. It was their turn. The stories about them traveled fast. Coworkers whispered about seeing Emily in line at food pantries, her once perfect posture bent under the weight of defeat. Former neighbors told me how my father had been spotted in the early mornings outside convenience stores, begging for odd jobs, anything that would cover the next night's room rate. My mother, who once bragged about Emily's beauty to anyone who would listen, now avoided eye contact with strangers, pulling her coat tighter as if she could disappear. The same mouths that once shaped my invisibility now tasted their own shame. I didn't interfere. I didn't call. I didn't show up with money or solutions. The old me might have. But this new version of myself, forged in betrayal and sharpened by their cruelty, knew better. I let them carry their garbage bags. I let them walk through lobbies with sticky floors and stained mattresses. I let Emily face the world without her armor of vanity. Every step they took into those motels was a step they had chosen years ago. When they dismissed me, excluded me, and drained me of more than money, they had drained me of hope. Now justice demanded I leave them there. Sometimes when I drove past their side of town, I wondered if they ever thought of me as they lay awake on lumpy mattresses, listening to the buzz of neon motel signs. Did they imagine me in my Hudson View apartment sipping wine while their world collapsed? Did they understand yet that I wasn't coming back, that no amount of tears or pleas would change the course of what they had set in motion? I doubted it. They had never been good at learning lessons. But the world has a way of teaching, and this was their curriculum now. I didn't hate them as I once did. Hatred takes energy, and I had wasted enough of mine on them. What I felt was colder, more final indifference. I could see them and drive away without so much as a heartbeat quickening, and that, I realized, was the truest freedom of all. They no longer had the power to touch me, not even with their disgrace. The child who once sat at family dinners invisible while Emily was praised would have never believed this day would come. Yet here it was, undeniable, raw, and just. My parents and Emily, stripped of their masks, left with nothing but garbage bags and broken pride. And me free at last from their grip, unshaken, untouched, unbound. The house that excluded me now had no room for them. I had thought I had seen every kind of fall from grace my family could endure, but when Emily's mask finally cracked all the way through, it still managed to shock me. After the foreclosure, after the public humiliation, after the endless gossip, they had already been reduced to motels and shelters, their lives packed into garbage bags and stuffed into the trunks of borrowed cars. I had driven past them, seen the husks of the people who once lorded their superiority over me, and felt nothing but a cold acknowledgement of justice. But Emily, the self-proclaimed golden child, wasn't finished. She still thought she could dig her way out of the grave she had dug, and in doing so, she only managed to tunnel deeper into the rot. I first learned of her final betrayal not through her directly, but from a voicemail left on my office line. A debt collector, his voice oily with greed, left a message asking if I was willing to discuss a settlement on accounts I had never even opened. He rattled off my workplace address, my apartment location, even my direct office extension. That information was not public, not easily found. I knew instantly that it had been sold, and there was only one person desperate enough, shameless enough to peddle my privacy like a trinket at a pawn shop. Emily had traded pieces of my life in exchange for pocket change and the false promise of reprieve from her own creditors. For a moment, I was back in childhood watching her wave my letters around like they were a joke to share with friends. My words twisted into something cheap. But this wasn't middle school mockery. This was dangerous. She had tried to sell me out to people who had no reason to show restraint. When I confronted the situation with my lawyer, his disgust was palpable. He told me Emily had likely approached multiple collectors offering whatever scraps of information she could gather about me, my work hours, my schedule, my apartment location. In return, she had hoped they would forgive her mounting debts she had no realistic way of repaying. But the plan backfired spectacularly. Collectors who initially entertained her desperation soon realized she had nothing to offer of real value and no assets to seize. Instead, when they discovered her harassment of me, her repeated attempts to drag me into her pit, they turned the tables. They filed complaints, threatened legal action, and soon Emily was facing charges of harassment herself. She had not only failed to secure money, she had added a new weight of lawsuits and fees to her already collapsing world. The same creditors she had begged to save her were now intent on destroying her. When the truth spilled into daylight, even my parents couldn't spin the story. They were forced to confront a version of Emily they had always refused to see. The daughter they had lifted up, defended blindly, excused endlessly, had sold out her own sister for scraps. My mother's denial cracked first. She tried to claim Emily must have been misled or confused, but even she couldn't keep the quiver out of her voice. My father, usually quick to roar at me for any accusation, sat in stunned silence. And Emily, my sister, who once strutted in designer shoes, who once laughed at the idea of consequences, was left with nothing but her own excuses. She cried that she had no choice, that she was drowning, that she only wanted to survive. But all I saw was the reflection of every choice she had made to put herself above me, every step that had led her here. What broke the last of their unholy alliance wasn't my voice, but theirs. For the first time, my parents recoiled, not from me, but from Emily. They looked at her with something I had never seen in their eyes before: horror. Horror that the golden child they had worshipped was capable of crawling so low, of trying to sell her sister like a commodity. My father called her reckless. My mother whispered the word disgrace. In that moment, the pedestal crumbled. The daughter they had once sacrificed me to protect had finally destroyed herself in their eyes. I wish I could say I felt triumph, but what I felt was colder, harder, and more enduring. It wasn't satisfaction so much as vindication. The confirmation of what I had always known, but they had always denied that Emily was not a victim, not a shining star, but a parasite who would bleed anyone dry to keep her reflection polished. And now, there was no polish left. Only grime debt and the filth of betrayal too severe to ignore. The calls from creditors stopped once my lawyer filed counterclaims and harassment suits. My information was protected, my life untouched. But Emily was left tangled in a legal mess she had created with her own hands. Court dates, restraining orders, threats of fines. Her last gambit had ended with her crawling through the very sewer she had dug for herself. And for once my parents didn't defend her. They didn't call me to demand I forgive. They didn't cry for me to help family. They sat in their rented motel room staring at their daughter like she was a stranger. For me, that silence was louder than any apology could have been. And as I stood on the outside watching the empire of lies collapse once more, I understood that Emily's final betrayal had not only destroyed her, it had finally severed the last ties that bound us together. For the first time in my life, I was free of her shadow. The golden child was now crawling in sewers. It was almost poetic the way Emily's desperate betrayal seemed to mark the very bottom of her fall. For years, I had been the one crawling in the shadows, trying to measure up, trying to hold on to some version of family love that never existed. And now, after she had stooped so low as to sell my personal information for a few dollars and ended up sued for harassment, the roles had reversed completely. She was the one flailing in the dirt while I was rising higher than I had ever imagined. That realization didn't come all at once, though. It unfolded in layers the same way my life had unfolded over years of being overlooked. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't afraid to embrace my own ascent. At work, the recognition came with a sense of inevitability. My years of relentless dedication, of staying late when no one else wanted to, of mentoring junior associates while quietly carrying the weight of complex projects, all of it had finally caught the attention of those who mattered. When the promotion was announced, naming me Senior Vice President, with a salary of $180,000, I felt an odd stillness inside. Not excitement, not even relief. Just the quiet confirmation that I had always been worth this even when my own family refused to see it. The applause of my colleagues echoed in the conference hall, and as I shook hands with the CEO, I thought back to all the dinners where my straight A's had been brushed off as expected. That moment was mine, and I didn't owe it to anyone but myself. Yet my rise wasn't only professional, it was deeply personal. I had finally given myself permission to seek help, to sit in a therapist's office and unpack decades of wounds that had been stuffed into silence. Week after week, I found myself shedding layers of shame I didn't even know I carried. For the first time, I spoke the words aloud, I was never loved for who I was. Saying it didn't break me, it freed me. Therapy became the bridge between the little girl who cried alone in her bedroom and the woman who now stood tall in her own worth. Outside the office and the therapist's room, I began to build something even more precious, genuine friendships. People who wanted nothing from me but my presence, who didn't see me as a wallet or a shadow, but as Laura, the woman who made them laugh, who brought wine to girls' nights, who could sit around a table and be both strong and vulnerable. One friend, Marianne, once said to me over coffee, "I can't imagine how anyone could overlook you." Her words, so simple, pierced through years of invisibility. I no longer needed to imagine being part of a family I was creating, one of my own, piece by piece, made of people who chose me. And still, even in their ruin, my parents and Emily couldn't let me go. They didn't call anymore. I had made sure of that, but I knew they were watching. LinkedIn notifications revealed their prying eyes. My profile views spiked every time I updated a new accomplishment, every time my company shared a post featuring me in leadership. I could picture them huddled in whatever shabby motel or shelter they were now stuck in, staring at their screens, choking on envy as they scrolled through photos of me speaking at conferences, smiling with teams radiating the success they had once dismissed as meaningless. I didn't block them. Part of me wanted them to see. I wanted them to feel the sting of my name spoken with respect, in rooms they would never enter. I wanted Emily to know that while her marriage crumbled and her reputation rotted, my life was only beginning to blossom. I wanted my parents to see that the daughter they had treated as expendable had become everything they pretended Emily was without ever needing their validation. Sometimes late at night I wondered if that made me cruel. But then I remembered the years of manipulation, the pleas for money framed as for family's honor, the coldness in their voices when they excluded me from the wedding I had paid for. Cruelty wasn't in my DNA, it had been theirs all along. What I was doing now wasn't cruelty, it was justice. The more I leaned into my own growth, the less their existence mattered. Their names stopped slipping into my daily thoughts. Their faces faded from the forefront of my mind. Yet ironically, I became the center of theirs. I could almost feel their jealousy like a bitter wind pressing against me, trying to pull me back into the shadows. But the truth was undeniable, the world spun beautifully without them, and their envy only devoured what little they had left. The world spun beautifully without them, and jealousy consumed them. Their jealousy had already been gnawing at them when the rejections began to pile up one after another like doors slamming shut in their faces. I didn't need to lift a finger for it to happen. Life and truth had a way of catching up with people who built their worlds on lies. After years of painting themselves as victims of twisting every story to make me the cold, selfish daughter, they finally had to face a world that no longer believed them. The very people who once clapped them on the back, attended their parties, and praised Emily's shallow charm began to distance themselves, as though touching my family would stain them too. The first to go were their old friends. These were couples my parents had vacationed with, neighbors they'd proudly hosted at barbecues, people who once admired Emily as though she was destined for greatness. When the foreclosure became public and they were left homeless, my parents knocked on those same doors begging for a couch, a spare room, anything, but the doors stayed closed. One friend, a woman I barely remembered from my teens, later admitted to me that when she saw my mother on her porch, she told her flatly, "You always said Laura was selfish, but now I know better. I won't be part of this." My parents left her driveway humiliated, and it became the first of many refusals. Then came the church. For decades, they had paraded Emily around at Sunday services as the talented daughter, the future of the family, while I was the one they never mentioned. My donations had quietly covered youth programs and building repairs, but no one ever knew because my parents claimed the credit. When their fall from grace became impossible to hide, they turned to the church for charity. The pastor called me curious about the full story. For the first time, I told him everything, how they'd used my money, erased me from family milestones, and left me standing in the shadows of their lies. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Laura, the congregation will no longer be used to enable this behavior." The following Sunday, instead of receiving sympathy, my parents sat through a sermon about honoring all children equally and the dangers of favoritism. People avoided their pew. No donation envelopes came their way. Whatever scraps of dignity they hoped to salvage from faith had vanished. But perhaps the cruelest rejections came from Emily's own circle. She had spent her life crafting an image of effortless charm, surrounding herself with allies who propped up her illusion of superiority. When her marriage dissolved and her career collapsed, she turned to them. She called bridesmaids who had once gushed over her old college friends, who had once envied her social sparkle. But social media is a merciless mirror. Posts began to surface. Sometimes you don't see someone's true colors until they bleed you dry. One former bridesmaid wrote, tagged vaguely but clearly aimed at Emily. Another shared an old group photo and wrote, "Grateful I distanced myself from toxic people." Comments piled up. Emily's carefully cultivated image was shattered in a place she could never control the public eye. I didn't gloat openly, but I watched. I watched as people who once bought into their story of my supposed coldness now told the truth out loud. I watched as Emily's allies peeled away one by one, leaving her exposed and alone. She had once been the center of every room. Now, even in virtual spaces, she was radioactive. Through it all, I stayed silent. Silence was my weapon now. My name didn't need to be spoken. I had told my story where it mattered, and the truth had taken on a life of its own. The people who had chosen to believe my parents' lies saw now what I had lived through. They weren't fooled anymore. My family had built a house of cards, and the world itself had blown it down. I sometimes imagined them huddled together in whatever dingy corner they could find, whispering about how unfair it all was. They probably told themselves everyone else had turned cold, that I had poisoned the well. But deep down they had to know. They had sown the seeds of their own exile, and now they were reaping it in full. The irony was bitter and beautiful at once. They had always believed they were untouchable, that their charm, their manipulation, their golden child would always open doors for them. But now every door was closing. Friends, church allies, all gone. Their world had shrunk to nothing, and yet one door did remain. Mine. They must have known it even if they couldn't admit it. The thought of me must have hovered at the back of their minds each time they were turned away. I was the daughter who had the resources, the connections, the stability. I was the only one who could rescue them now. But they had forgotten one crucial truth. My door had been locked long ago. When every door closed, only mine remained, but I had locked it myself. I had thought I had seen every kind of fall from grace my family could endure, but nothing quite prepared me for what I began to notice once their faces disappeared from the circles they once clung to. At first, I heard about their circumstances through whispers, the way one hears gossip that drifts like smoke through town. But eventually I saw it with my own eyes, and those moments are carved into me as deeply as any wound they ever gave me. After the church turned them away, and every friend closed the door, they had nowhere else to run. They no longer had a house, no relatives willing to offer a couch, no sanctuary left in the community. They were reduced to sleeping in their old car parked in the dimly lit edges of Walmart parking lots, trying to curl up in the back seat like teenagers sneaking out for fun. Except this wasn't teenage rebellion, it was survival. They stuffed plastic grocery bags with the remnants of their clothes and propped them against the car windows to keep out the early morning chill. I drove past one night purely by coincidence on my way back from a late dinner with colleagues. The glow of my headlights caught the familiar silhouette of their car, and there they were huddled inside. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I remembered every time they made me feel small, every time they dismissed me as unworthy, every humiliation they had let drip from their mouths like poison. Now they sat in the dark, invisible to the world that had once given them an audience, and I realized they were tasting what I had swallowed for decades in visibility. It wasn't just the car where they tried to survive. By day, they went from food pantry to food pantry, collecting boxes of dry pasta and cans of beans. I knew because I began to recognize their faces in the lines when I occasionally volunteered with one of the city's outreach programs. They didn't see me there, I made sure of it. Watching from a distance, I took in the sight of my mother, once so proud of her appearance, now with hair undone and hands trembling as she reached for a bag of rice. My father, who had spoken in booming tones at family gatherings as if he were the head of some dynasty, kept his eyes glued to the ground, avoiding recognition. And Emily, the sister who had always been held aloft as the family jewel, stood behind them in the same line, her face pale, her body language deflated, clutching a plastic bag as though it were the last shred of dignity she could carry. But it was the panhandling that finally struck me with a cold wave of bitter clarity. One afternoon, I was walking back from the office when I noticed a cluster of people sitting on the curb outside the very elementary school where I had once won academic prizes that no one in my family cared about. I slowed without meaning to, my steps caught by some old intuition. There they were, my parents and Emily, sitting on the ground with a cardboard sign that read, "Family in need, please help." My chest tightened in ways I can't fully describe, not because I felt pity, No pity had been burned out of me long ago. It was something else. It was the recognition of irony sharp and cruel. They had once demanded that the world see Emily, that every eye be on her, and every ear tuned to her story. And me, I had been the shadow unseen, unheard. Now, here they were begging strangers for acknowledgement, holding out a cup like invisibility itself had wrapped them up and forced them to live the very rejection they had once forced on me. They noticed me that day, though, only for a flicker of a second. Our eyes met across the crowd. I saw the instant flash of shame cross Emily's face, how she immediately turned away, pretending not to recognize me. My mother fiddled with the sign, her lips trembling, and my father bent lower, his shoulders folding inward as if he could collapse into himself. They wanted to disappear. And I let them. I kept walking, my heels clicking against the pavement, each step echoing louder in my own ears than the coins that clinked into their empty cup from passing strangers. For the first time, they were stripped of all the illusions they had ever clung to. They were no longer the proud parents of the golden child. They were beggars on a street corner, avoiding the gaze of their own daughter, the one they had exiled from their table. I didn't stop, I didn't speak, and I certainly didn't give. My silence was heavier than any coin could have been. In that moment, I understood the strange symmetry of it all. Life has a way of circling back, of forcing people to face their own cruelty in the most brutal ways. They had turned me into a ghost in my own family, unseen and unheard for years. And now the world had returned the favor. They sat as shadows on the sidewalk, diminished, ignored, hoping for scraps of kindness from strangers who didn't even know their names. I felt no triumph, no joy, just the final confirmation that justice in its own twisted way had been served. I walked on my head high, the city swallowing me into its hum, leaving them to choke on their invisibility. They were now just shadows of their former selves. They were shadows now drifting aimlessly, and I thought I had seen the lowest point they could possibly reach. I was wrong. One Friday evening, as I returned home from work, briefcase in hand, and exhaustion clinging to me like a second skin, I saw them. Right there on the sidewalk outside my building's glass doors. My family, my parents, and Emily, kneeling on the cold concrete, waiting like supplicants before a temple they could never enter. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But the reality was harsher. They were truly there. Gaunt and unkempt, the years of entitlement finally stripped away, leaving only desperation behind. My doorman had tried to move them along, I could tell. He hovered nearby, uneasy, as if he knew that despite their presence, this was something deeply personal he couldn't interfere with. Passers-by slowed, some whispering, some staring, openly, phones half raised, to record what promised to be another spectacle in the city. New York doesn't pause for much, but raw human tragedy has its way of catching eyes. My mother's face lit up when she spotted me. She looked older than I remembered, her hair dull and gray, her cheeks hollow. She reached out with trembling hands as if I were some savior returning from exile. My father bowed his head, shoulders slumped, the man who once ruled my childhood with authority, now reduced to a begging shadow. And Emily. Oh, Emily. Her once pristine appearance was gone. The polished hair, the designer clothes, the carefully curated confidence had been stripped away. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, her voice cracking as she spoke words I never thought I'd hear. I envied you all my life, she said, her voice almost a whisper. I thought if I took everything, maybe I'd feel whole. But I was wrong. I ruined myself trying to eclipse you. Please. I can't take this anymore. Help us. Her confession hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. I should have felt vindicated. Maybe a younger version of me, the girl who had written birthday letters only to watch them mocked, would have clung to those words like water in the desert. But as I stood there staring at them, kneeling before me, all I felt was a hollow calm. Memories unspooled in my mind, each one sharper than the last. Birthdays where my name wasn't even mentioned. Family dinners where my achievements were brushed aside while Emily's smallest gestures were applauded like miracles. The time they used my credit at 16 to buy her a car, leaving me to pay off the debt. The night of the wedding, the one I had paid for, when they had looked me in the eye and said, "It was only for family." That sentence had seared itself into my bones, a scar that never healed. And now here they were, calling themselves my family again because it suited their survival. The irony was almost poetic. People were staring. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting to see what I would do. Perhaps they thought I would melt, that I would extend mercy like a saint, that forgiveness would be my grand gesture. But forgiveness had long since burned away in the fires of betrayal. What remained was clarity. I thought of the nights I had lain awake exhausted from work, but unable to sleep because I was calculating how much I could spare for them while still covering my rent. I thought of the humiliation of sitting silently at family gatherings treated as less than human. I thought of the bitter taste of standing outside their world, knocking endlessly, only to be told I didn't belong. They had taken my kindness and carved it into their ladder, climbing higher while pressing my face into the ground. They had cut me out of their definition of family, and only now, when the world had turned its back on them, did they remember my worth. Emily's words replayed in my head. I envied you all my life. A confession, yes, but also proof that nothing had ever been about love. It was about competition, about possession, about her need to diminish me to feel significant. She hadn't envied my childhood loneliness or my quiet victories. She had envied my strength, my independence, my refusal to crumble completely under the weight of their cruelty. And now she wanted me to hand it all back to her, neatly wrapped, as though nothing had happened. I studied them, 3 broken figures kneeling before the gleaming lobby of my building, and felt an odd detachment, as though I were watching a play. Once I would have been desperate to step into the scene to rewrite it to finally be accepted. But now I saw it for what it was, the closing act of a story I no longer belonged to. My mother sobbed openly. My father mumbled something about family sticking together, and Emily reached for my hand, her fingers dirty, trembling. I didn't flinch, but I didn't extend mine either. Instead, I let the silence speak. It pressed down on all of us, heavy and unyielding, louder than any outburst could have been. I could have said so much. I could have hurled their betrayals back at them, listed every slight, every theft, every wound, but that would have given them power. Instead, I gave them nothing. No anger, no tears, no compassion. Only the cold truth of my indifference. They had taken everything they could from me, but they could not take the ability to walk past them without faltering. The power to choose silence over pleading. The freedom of finally, irrevocably being done. So I stood still for one long moment, meeting Emily's eyes, as hers filled with the horror of realizing I would not bend. Then I shifted my briefcase, turned toward the doors, and let the doorman open them for me. Their cries followed me into the lobby, muffled by the thick glass, swallowed by the hum of the elevator, as I pressed the button for my floor. This time I stood watching without a single tear. When I saw them kneeling outside my building the night before, part of me had wondered if they could sink any lower. But the next morning, when I stepped out and found them there, again disheveled, eyes swollen from sleeplessness, I realized they weren't going anywhere until they wrung one last drop of pity out of me. Security had already warned them the previous night, yet here they were, stubborn in their humiliation. I stood tall, my heels clicking against the marble as I approached, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the invisible daughter or the spare part of the family. I felt like the one in control. My mother's hands trembled as she reached for mine, but I stepped back. "Please," she whispered, her voice raspy from crying. "We'll do better, just help us this once." My father's eyes darted around the lobby, filled with strangers watching, recording on their phones. He hated being on display like that, and I could see the shame etched into his rigid posture. Emily, red-eyed and broken, muttered something about being sorry, but I could tell even then that her apology was a performance as hollow as all the others. They wanted money. They wanted my compliance. They didn't want me. I looked at them, really looked. The parents who had stripped me of recognition. The sister who had drained me of money and dignity. The family who had excluded me from every milestone that mattered. Every scar they left on me was right there in their faces. For years, I had played the role of dutiful daughter, believing that if I gave enough, they would finally love me. That delusion shattered the day they told me Emily's wedding had already happened without me. Now, with them kneeling before me, the script had flipped. They were the beggars, and I was the one holding all the power. "No," I said. My voice didn't shake, didn't falter, didn't hold a trace of anger. It was steady, final, almost frightening in its simplicity. Not this time. Not ever again. For a moment, silence hung in the air, so thick you could cut it with a knife. My words echoed in the lobby, bouncing off glass and stone. Then the sobbing began. My mother collapsed fully onto the floor, clutching at the hem of my skirt, but I stepped away, leaving her grasping at air. My father cursed under his breath, trying to salvage his pride even as his knees buckled. Emily let out a pitiful wail so unrecognizable from the poised golden child she once pretended to be that I almost pitied her. Almost. Security moved in quickly as they had been instructed. 2 guards approached their faces carefully, neutral, professional. They tried to help my parents to their feet, but my mother clung to the ground as if her desperation could anchor her there. The guards didn't argue. They simply lifted her under the arms and carried her out of the lobby, her sobs filling the space. My father followed, less resistant, but no less broken. Emily stumbled after them, her tears streaking through smeared mascara, her dignity gone. The onlookers parted like water, whispering, some shaking their heads, others capturing every second on their phones. I didn't chase after them. I didn't soothe. I didn't feel the pull of guilt that had always tethered me to them. Instead, I straightened my jacket, nodded to the security guards in quiet gratitude, and walked with measured steps toward the elevator. My heels clicked in perfect rhythm, like a drumbeat marking the end of a long, brutal march. As I pressed the button and waited for the doors to open, I felt something lift off my shoulders, a weight that had been pressing down on me for 36 years. The heaviness of obligation, the chains of guilt, the constant gnawing hunger for approval, all of it fell away in that moment. I hadn't just said no to their plea. I had said no to the years of being their scapegoat, their ATM, their afterthought. I had reclaimed myself in that single word. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped inside. For the first time in decades, I didn't look back. As the doors closed, shutting out their cries, I drew in a deep breath and realized something extraordinary. Freedom wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, a calm that wrapped itself around me and whispered, "You're done." I leaned against the mirrored wall, meeting my own gaze in the reflection. My face looked different. Calmer, sharper, stronger. I wasn't the overlooked daughter anymore. I wasn't the gullible sister or the dutiful child. I was me, whole and unbroken, with no strings left tying me to their chaos. And as the elevator ascended, taking me back to the life I had built with my own 2 hands, I thought one final truth, the kind that settled deep in my bones and stayed there like a vow I would never break. They had no power over me anymore. When the glass doors of my building closed behind me, I thought the night was over. I had walked away from them, left their cries echoing on the sidewalk, and felt the first taste of freedom that had eluded me all my life. But freedom, I was learning, wasn't just about walking away. It was about facing the words, the very phrases they had once used as weapons against me, and turning them back into the mirror they had always avoided. I didn't expect the chance to come so soon. A week later, during a preliminary hearing for the property case, we were seated in the small wood-paneled courtroom. My parents sat at one table, Emily beside them with her arms crossed, her face pale but still clinging to defiance. I sat opposite with my attorney, my posture calm, my voice silent but steady. The judge asked for statements of record, and the moment I had been waiting for presented itself like a stage curtain pulling back. I leaned forward, my voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Only for family," I said slowly, letting the words hang in the air. My parents' heads snapped up. The phrase that had been their justification, their wall, their exclusion, it was now being spoken before a court reporter, attorneys, and a judge. My lawyer didn't flinch. He had already seen how I intended to turn their cruelty into evidence. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but it was the kind of silence that demanded filling. My father tried to laugh it off, muttering something about family disagreements blown out of proportion, but when pressed, when documents were placed on the table, he faltered. My mother shifted in her chair, her hands trembling. Emily's eyes darted between them, knowing that the walls they had built were crumbling. Then came the moment I had not anticipated. Under questioning, my mother admitted in a low, broken voice, we were shadows of our own parents. They treated us the same way, and we didn't know how to stop it. My father nodded reluctantly, adding, we repeated what was done to us. That's all. It was an opening one they perhaps thought would soften me, a plea for sympathy masked as confession. For a brief moment I felt the old pull, the instinct to find understanding, to fill the cracks with forgiveness. But then the steel in me hardened again, and I asked the one question that mattered. I leaned forward, my voice sharp as glass. Then why didn't you break the cycle? Why did you choose to pass the wound instead of heal it? You had the chance. You had decades of chances, and you used me to carry your excuses. The court reporter's fingers clicked across the keys, immortalizing every word. Their confession, their justification, my rebuttal. It was all now official, preserved in records that couldn't be rewritten or denied. There would be no more pretending, no more backroom whispers, no more family dinners where truth was conveniently forgotten. The look on their faces told me they finally understood. They hadn't just lost their house, their social standing, or their money. They had lost control of the narrative. For years, they had crafted stories to protect Emily, to minimize me, to keep themselves from blame. Now, in front of witnesses and under oath, their own mouths had destroyed those illusions. As we left the courtroom, I walked past them slowly. Emily refused to meet my eyes. My father stared at the floor. My mother's lips trembled, as though she wanted to call out, but knew there was nothing left to say that could undo what had been spoken. The hallway was filled with murmurs from extended relatives who had come to observe. They had heard everything. The family secrets once buried were now shared knowledge, and no one would carry my parents' excuses for them again. I didn't feel triumph in that moment. Not the hot, burning triumph of revenge. What I felt was colder, cleaner. It was the final cutting of a cord, the proof that the truth itself was my greatest weapon. I didn't have to scream, didn't have to rage. All I had to do was repeat their own words back to them and let them drown in the echo. Later that night, sitting in my apartment with the city lights glittering across the river, I thought back to every time they had silenced me. Every dinner where my achievements were ignored, every time I was told to step aside for Emily, every phone call where I was reminded of my obligation. Those words had built the prison I lived in for decades. Now those same words had become bars that closed around them instead. I sipped my wine, staring out the window, and let the quiet wash over me. This wasn't the end of the story, not yet. But it was the turning point I had been waiting for, the moment where I no longer had to fight for validation. The record spoke for itself. The witnesses had seen. The documents were signed. I no longer had to carry the burden of proof because they had handed it to me with their own trembling voices. Their empire of lies had collapsed, not because I screamed it down, but because the foundation was rotten and they themselves exposed it. That was the deepest irony and perhaps the cruelest justice. Their words became their own sentence. I remember the day the final reckoning arrived and how it didn't come in the form of loud fireworks or courtroom drama, but in the slow, undeniable unraveling of every last piece they had once clung to. After the sting of their words being turned back on them, after they realized the cycle they had chosen to repeat instead of break, there was nothing left to shield them from the tidal wave of consequences that followed. Their home, already lost to foreclosure, was gone. But now the hollow shell of their pride was stripped away piece by piece, and I watched with the clarity of someone who had lived too long in their shadow. The house was auctioned off its deed, signed away without a trace of the years they had lorded it over me as proof of their stability and superiority. It wasn't just the house, though. The contents inside, the furniture my father used to polish on Sundays, the china set my mother displayed only for guests, the photos that had hung on the walls, as though they told a story of unity, were all sold off for pennies on the dollar. Even Emily's wedding dress, the $8,000 gown I had unknowingly paid for, ended up pawned at a second-hand shop. I later heard someone bought it for $200, a cruel reduction that perfectly matched the fall from grace my family had orchestrated for themselves. To the world, these were just items. To them, they were symbols of the life they thought they'd built on lies, manipulation, and exploitation of me. Watching them dissolve into strangers' hands was like watching their illusions disintegrate into dust. As their material possessions disappeared, their unity crumbled faster. I heard from neighbors and mutual acquaintances that every day was a battlefield. My father shouted that it was my mother's constant spoiling of Emily that led to their ruin. My mother wailed that my father should have been a stronger provider. Emily, broken and bitter, screamed at both of them for dragging her down with them, insisting that none of it was her fault. They tore each other apart in cramped rooms and shelters, pointing fingers, rewriting history in desperate attempts to avoid shouldering blame. The family that had once presented such a united front against me now couldn't even eat a meal without accusing each other of betrayal. It was as though the rot that had always been there, hidden beneath years of favoritism and cruelty, had finally broken through the surface, consuming them from within. And me, I felt a quiet shift inside myself. For so long I had carried pieces of them with me in memories and tokens I wasn't sure I was ready to let go of. Old photographs, smiling faces, staged family gatherings, snapshots of holidays where I had been the one behind the camera, unseen, unacknowledged. I had kept them stored away, almost as though keeping those images meant I hadn't been completely erased from the narrative. But the moment came when I scrolled through my phone and saw those pictures again. Emily posing in her prom dress, my parents standing in front of the house, birthdays, where I stood awkwardly at the side. Each image was a reminder, not of love, but of absence, of erasure, of the invisible weight I had carried for decades. With a steady hand, I pressed delete. One by one, they vanished. And then I did the same with the backups I had saved in the cloud. It wasn't rage that drove me to erase them. It was release. It was the quiet liberation of no longer needing proof of a family that had never truly included me. As the last image faded from the screen, I realized I had escaped not just their demands, not just their cruelty, but the golden cage they had built around me. For years they had dressed that cage in ribbons of obligation and bars of guilt, making me believe that my worth was only what I could provide. But now, with nothing left binding me to them, I saw the truth clearly. The cage had never been mine to live in. It had been theirs, and they had locked themselves inside it while throwing away the key. They were stripped of everything, broken, angry, and alone. And me, I was free. Truly free. I had escaped their golden cage forever. Shame has a way of lingering long after material possessions are gone. When their house, their savings, and even their pride had already been stripped away, what remained was their name, and in a small community like ours, that name carried weight. Unfortunately for them, it became the kind of weight that crushed instead of lifted. Their downfall spread like wildfire faster than they could ever have imagined. It wasn't me fueling it anymore. It was the collective voice of neighbors, acquaintances, and even strangers who had heard enough to turn their story into a living cautionary tale. Parenting groups online began circulating their saga as a warning how favoritism and exploitation could poison a family from the inside out. Articles popped up in forums with headlines like, "Don't Raise an Emily," and how parental neglect creates invisible children. My family's story wasn't just gossip anymore. It was education material dissected by strangers, eager to extract meaning from their disgrace. They had wanted to be admired, envied even, but instead their names became synonymous with failure. For Emily, the weight was unbearable. Once she had preened herself on her looks and her charm, counting on them to open doors to love and opportunity. Now her name on a dating app was enough to turn her into a pariah. Screenshots of her profiles were posted on local Facebook groups, captioned with warnings. "Watch out. She's the woman who used her sister's money for her wedding and then left her out of it." Potential matches unmatched her the moment they recognized her face, and any message she sent was ignored or ridiculed. I was told she tried to hide behind aliases, but people always found out. The internet doesn't forgive or forget, and her reputation had grown too notorious to escape. Employers treated her no better. Each time she applied for a job, even ones far beneath her former title, someone would inevitably Google her. Articles, comments, and viral posts ensured she was unemployable. She was forced to rely on temporary gigs that ended quickly once someone made the connection. What once had been her pride, her social confidence, her belief that she could talk her way into anything, was now her undoing because her own words and actions lived online forever. My parents fared no better. Their world was smaller, rooted in church circles and neighborhood routines, but that smallness only amplified their disgrace. When a pastor used their treatment of me as an example in a sermon about honoring all children equally, people whispered, and then those whispers became stares. Even the church, the place they had leaned on for reputation and sympathy, quietly cut ties. Volunteers who once offered them food assistance stopped showing up. Invitations to gatherings vanished. Their names weren't just ignored, they were actively avoided. They couldn't leave town either. With no money, no resources, and no friends left willing to take them in, they were trapped in the very place where everyone knew their failures best. Each trip to the grocery store, each step into a public space carried the weight of being recognized as the parents who had disowned their own daughter for money. There was no escape for them, not even in anonymity. For me, it was a strange, almost surreal experience. I didn't need to say anything anymore. The world was doing the work for me, holding them accountable in ways I never could have orchestrated on my own. Their disgrace had become irreversible, cemented into community memory, etched into online spaces, and replayed in every whispered conversation. They had climbed so high on their illusions of superiority, only to find themselves on the other side of a long, devastating fall. From the peak, they had fallen into disgrace. I never imagined that one day my story, the story of being the forgotten daughter, the invisible child, and then the walking bank account for my family, would be told on a stage in front of hundreds of women. Yet there I was, standing behind a podium at a women's leadership conference in New York City, staring out at a sea of faces waiting to hear me speak. I had been invited as the keynote speaker not because of my corporate title, but because of the personal journey I had endured, and the strength I had found in finally reclaiming my life. As I looked around that ballroom filled with women of all ages, I realized that for the first time in my life, my voice wasn't being silenced, overshadowed, or dismissed. It was being amplified. I began my speech not with statistics or career advice, but with the truth I had carried like a stone in my chest for decades. I told them how I had grown up in the shadow of a sister who could do no wrong, how my achievements were brushed aside while hers were celebrated, how my parents had used me like a safety net for their poor choices. I spoke about wiring $35,000 for a wedding that I wasn't even invited to attend, about scrolling through photos of that wedding on Facebook, while my sister wrote that she was finally free from my shadow. I described the moment when the betrayal finally cut deep enough that I stopped being the daughter who would bend until she broke. As I told my story, I could see women nodding, some wiping tears from their eyes, others gripping the hands of their friends beside them. It wasn't just about me anymore. My pain had become a mirror reflecting back to them their own stories of dismissal, betrayal, or being taken for granted. And when I finished, when I declared that I had finally freed myself from the cycle of manipulation and found a life where I no longer needed their approval, the audience rose to their feet. The sound of the ovation washed over me, filling a space that had once been hollow inside me. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I simply stood tall, knowing that I was no longer the invisible shadow. But the speech was only the beginning. Not long after that conference, an anonymous podcast released an episode about my story. It wasn't my name, but it was my life. The creator had asked for my permission to share it, changing identifying details while preserving the truth of my journey. At first, I worried it would expose me in ways I wasn't ready for, but then I realized anonymity gave me freedom. The episode spread like wildfire. Within weeks, it had millions of downloads. Women, men, even teenagers wrote to the podcast host about how they recognized their own families in mine, how my resilience gave them courage to set boundaries, to walk away, to demand respect. My voice, once silenced at my own family's dinner table, now echoed in living rooms, cars, and headphones across the world. The irony was not lost on me. My story had become bigger than my family ever dreamed, and it was being told without them, without their permission, without their control. And of course, the echoes of that success reached them. I didn't have to guess. I knew. They still stalked me online, clinging to scraps of information about my life, punishing themselves with every achievement they read about. I knew they saw the clips of my speech on YouTube, read the comments under the podcast, and realized that the narrative they had tried to control had slipped completely from their grasp. They had wanted me to stay silent, to play the role of the useful but unworthy daughter. Instead, my silence toward them had turned into a megaphone toward the world. Then came Emily's last attempt. Late one night, long after I had stopped expecting any form of communication from her, an email arrived in my inbox. It was sent from a public library computer in a neighboring town with no signature, no subject line, just a plea. Please? It began just one conversation. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. I don't have anything left. All I want is a chance to speak with you. For a brief moment, I stared at the words and felt a flicker of the old instinct, the part of me that once wanted so desperately to be seen by her, to be loved by her. But it passed quickly. I had given her decades of chances, thousands of dollars, countless nights of tears. Every conversation had been a setup for manipulation. Every promise of change had been broken before the ink was dry. I didn't reply. I didn't even draft a response. I blocked the address and forwarded the email to my attorney, who traced it and confirmed it came from the library computer. There was no satisfaction in that final confirmation, only a kind of quiet closure. Emily had been reduced to sending anonymous emails in the dark, while I stood in bright lights on stages, my story celebrated by strangers who believed in me more than my own family ever had. And so, I let silence be my final answer. Not rage, not rebuttal, not even explanation. Just silence. Because silence in that moment spoke louder than anything else could. It carried the weight of every betrayal, every dismissal, every humiliation, and transformed them into the sound of freedom. My silence was deafening. Only their echoes remained. When I walked off that conference stage, the roar of applause still ringing in my ears, I felt something shift deep inside me. For years, I had lived in the shadows of other people's stories, bending and breaking myself to fit into the mold of what they wanted me to be. For years, I believed my worth depended on their approval, their validation, their love. Now standing tall in front of hundreds of women who saw me not as a burden, but as proof of resilience. I finally felt the weight slide off my shoulders. My life was no longer tethered to their cruelty. It belonged to me. The quiet after the storm was strange at first. For so long, every decision I made had been in reaction to them. My parents' demands, Emily's manipulations, the family's endless expectations. Without their chaos, the silence seemed almost too wide, too still. But then I realized silence wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space to build something new, something that was mine alone. It was the kind of silence that meant peace, not punishment. In that space, I began to reflect on what I wanted my life to mean. I had climbed the professional ladder, secured financial independence, and shed the poisonous ties of a family that never truly claimed me. But victory for its own sake wasn't enough. The little girl in me, the one who cried herself to sleep after being ignored at family dinners, whispered that I needed to do something more. That I needed to make sure no other child grew up believing invisibility was their only option. That whisper became the seed of my foundation. I poured months into shaping it, a nonprofit dedicated to helping children of toxic families find safe outlets, mentorship, and support. I wanted them to know they weren't crazy for feeling neglected or wrong for wanting to be seen. I wanted them to feel what I hadn't, that they mattered. The money I had once hemorrhaged into my parents' lies became the first donation, a poetic redirection of pain into purpose. Watching the foundation's name etched onto the first banner, I felt a pride deeper than any corporate award could ever give me. The gala came a year later. I stood in a hall filled with donors, survivors, and supporters who believed in the cause as fiercely as I did. Candlelight reflected off crystal glasses, and the air buzzed with the kind of hope I once thought impossible. After the speeches, a young woman approached me, her hands trembling as she clutched mine. She couldn't have been more than 19. She looked at me with tear-streaked cheeks and said, "You saved me. I thought I was the only one. But because of your story, I know I'm not alone. I know I can have a future." Her voice cracked on that last word, future, and I felt tears well in my own eyes for the first time in years, not from grief, but from recognition. She was me in another life, but she had a chance to heal sooner than I did. It was in that moment I understood fully. Revenge had never been the end game. It was the beginning. Revenge cut the chains. Yes, it freed me from their grip, from the constant drain of their demands, but freedom itself demanded more. It asked me to live not just away from them, but toward something greater. It asked me to take the pain and twist it into a rope strong enough to pull others out of the same dark pit. And for the first time, I was ready not just to survive, but to lead. I no longer looked back with longing or even with anger. The faces of my parents, of Emily, of all those who had diminished me, had blurred into something distant, irrelevant. Their downfall had been loud, messy, and public, but it no longer occupied my mind. What filled me instead were the faces of children who came to our programs, the letters from survivors who found solace in our work, the quiet evenings where I sat by my window and felt peace wrap around me like a warm blanket. I was living a life unshackled, a life of choice and compassion. The irony was not lost on me. The family that once taught me invisibility had, in their cruelty, given me the very fire I needed to be seen not by them, but by the people who mattered. They had lost their home, their reputation, their standing, and eventually even one another. But I had found something they never could, myself. Whole, unbroken, unapologetic. As I closed my eyes that night after the gala, I thought of the journey of every tear shed in silence, every check written in desperation, every cruel word that tried to cut me down. I thought of the little girl who once believed she was nothing more than a shadow, and I whispered to her softly but firmly, "We made it. We are free. They lost everything." And I finally found myself where no one could ever take it away again. And that was my story. The journey of a woman who grew up as a shadow in her own family, only to rise, break free, and finally find herself. If you've stayed with me until this very moment, I know this story must have stirred something in you. Maybe empathy, maybe the satisfaction of seeing justice done, or perhaps even the courage to stand up for yourself. But now I want to hear from you. What do you think about this story? If you were in my shoes, would you have acted differently? Do you believe that silence and walking away can sometimes be more powerful than direct revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments because your perspective can open new insights for this community. And if you want to keep following stories filled with drama, emotion, and truth, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Every subscription, every comment from you is the fuel that keeps me bringing more journeys of betrayal, justice, and empowerment to life. You've been here, you've witnessed how I stepped out of the shadows and into the light. and I hope you'll stay to continue exploring the kinds of stories that make us think, feel, and keep watching until the very end.